Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Take a moment to notice your breathing, the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you. Tonight we move deeper into the archives, where police reports hold their stories in careful, measured words that transform chaos into quiet order. The typewriter keys had left their impressions deep in the paper, each letter pressed with the deliberate force that characterized police reports from the era before computers transformed documentation into something more ephemeral. Lieutenant Patricia Walsh ran her fingers across the raised text of report number 872341, feeling the physical weight of words that had been committed to paper with such permanence that they seemed carved rather than typed. The report before her detailed and coded incident that had occurred on a rainy Thursday evening in March of 1987, when Officer Michael Torres had been dispatched to investigate what dispatch had classified as a possible breaking and entering at 1247 Elm Street. The address belonged to Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, an 81-year-old retired seamstress who lived alone in a house that her late husband had built with his own hands in 1952. Officer Torres had approached the call with the methodical care that characterized all of his work, beginning his report with a detailed description of the scene as he had found it. The front door of Mrs. Kellerman's house stood slightly ajar, moving gently in the evening breeze that carried the scent of spring rain and newly turned earth from the garden that Mrs. Kellerman maintained with obsessive care along the front walkway. The house itself showed no obvious signs of forced entry. The windows remained intact, their white-painted frames unmarked by tool marks or other evidence of tampering. The small porch that Mr. Kellerman had added in 1967 displayed Mrs. Kellerman's collection of ceramic planters, each one positioned precisely where she had placed it that morning, none disturbed by the passage of any intruder who might have used the porch to gain access to the house. Officer Torres had called out from the front door, announcing his presence in the clear, authoritative voice that police training had taught him to project in uncertain situations. His report noted that he had received no response, prompting him to enter the house while maintaining constant radio contact with dispatch, documenting each step of his progress for the official record that would later be typed with such care in the report that Lieutenant Walsh now studied. The interior of the house had been arranged with the meticulous attention to order that often characterized the homes of elderly people who had spent decades perfecting their domestic routines. Mrs. Kellerman's living room displayed furniture that had been carefully maintained for more than 30 years, each piece positioned to facilitate the traffic patterns that had developed over decades of daily life in the space. Officer Torres had documented the condition of each room as he conducted his search, noting the undisturbed state of Mrs. Kellerman's extensive collection of family photographs, the neat arrangement of her sewing supplies in the converted bedroom that served as her workshop, the kitchen where every dish had been washed and placed in its designated position in the cabinets that Mr. Kellerman had built to accommodate his wife's specific preferences for organization. It was in the bathroom that Officer Torres had found Mrs. Kellerman lying on the tile floor beside the bathtub, unconscious but breathing steadily. Her gray hair spread around her head like a halo against the white ceramic tiles that she had insisted on cleaning every Tuesday and Friday for more than 20 years. Her fall had apparently occurred while she was preparing for her evening bath, a routine that neighbors later confirmed she followed with clockwork regularity every night at exactly 7:30. The report detailed Officer Torres's immediate response to finding Mrs. Kellerman, documenting his call for paramedics while simultaneously checking for signs of injury that might require immediate first aid. He had found no obvious trauma, no indication that her fall had been caused by anything other than the kind of medical emergency that could strike anyone at any time. Regardless of their age or physical condition, Mrs. Kellerman's pulse had been strong and regular, her breathing unlabored despite her unconscious state. Officer Torres had positioned her carefully in the recovery position that police training had taught him, ensuring that her airway remained clear while they waited for paramedics to arrive with the medical equipment that would be needed to properly assess and treat her condition. The paramedics had arrived within 8 minutes of Officer Torres's call, a response time that the report noted with the kind of precision that characterized all police documentation from that period. Emergency medical technician Robert Kim had taken charge of Mrs. Kellerman's care, working with his partner to establish an 4-line and monitor her vital signs while preparing her for transport to Mercy General Hospital. Officer Torres had remained at the scene after Mrs. Kellerman's departure, conducting the thorough investigation that proper procedure required even in cases where criminal activity seemed unlikely. His report detailed his examination of the bathroom where Mrs. Kellerman had fallen, looking for any environmental factors that might have contributed to her accident. The bathroom tiles had been slightly wet, suggesting that Mrs. Kellerman had been running water for her bath when she fell. Officer Torres had tested the stability of the grab bars that Mr. Kellerman had installed beside the bathtub several years earlier, finding them securely mounted and capable of supporting considerable weight. The bathroom rug had been positioned safely away from the tub, eliminating the possibility that Mrs. Kellerman had slipped on loose fabric. His investigation had extended to Mrs. Kellerman's medicine cabinet, where he had documented the various prescription medications that she took for the chronic conditions that affected many people her age. The bottles were arranged alphabetically, each one labeled with clear instructions for proper dosage and timing, suggesting that Mrs. Kellerman had been diligent about following her doctor's orders. Regarding her medical care, Officer Torres had also noted the presence of several recent medical appointment cards attached to Mrs. Kellerman's refrigerator, with small magnets shaped like fruits that had probably been gifts from grandchildren or church friends. The appointments indicated regular visits to her primary care physician, an eye doctor, and a cardiologist, painting a picture of someone who took her health seriously and maintained appropriate medical supervision. The report included detailed descriptions of Officer Torres's efforts to locate family members who should be notified about Mrs. Kellerman's hospitalization. He had found an address book in Mrs. Kellerman's kitchen drawer, its pages filled with the careful handwriting that had characterized her correspondence with friends and family for decades. Mrs. Kellerman's daughter lived in California, a distance that made immediate travel difficult, but not impossible. Officer Torres had called her personally, explaining the situation with the combination of professional authority and human compassion that good police work required. His report noted that the daughter, Mrs. Sandra Mitchell, had expressed immediate concern and had begun making arrangements to travel back home to be with her mother during her recovery. Mrs. Kellerman's son lived locally, working as a manager at the hardware store that had served the community for more than 40 years. Officer Torres had contacted him at work, providing the same careful explanation he had given to the daughter, noting in his report that the son had immediately left work to go to the hospital where his mother was being treated. The investigation had also included interviews with Mrs. Kellerman's neighbors, people who had known her for decades and could provide insights into her daily routines and recent behavior that might be relevant to understanding the circumstances of her fall. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the house to the north, had spoken with Mrs. Kellerman earlier that day while both women were working in their gardens, noting nothing unusual about her neighbor's demeanor or physical condition. Mr. and Mrs. Robinson, who lived across the street, had noticed that Mrs. Kellerman's porch light had not come on at its usual time, which had prompted their call to police. They had explained to Officer Torres that Mrs. Kellerman was extraordinarily consistent in her habits, turning on her porch light every evening at exactly 7 o'clock. A routine that had become so reliable that neighbors used it as an informal timekeeper for their own evening activities. Officer Torres had documented these interviews with the same thorough attention to detail that characterized all aspects of his report. Understanding that information that seemed trivial at the moment of collection might prove significant later if Mrs. Kellerman's condition was found to be more serious than initially apparent. The hospital had called the police station later that evening to report that Mrs. Kellerman had regained consciousness and was in stable condition, having suffered what doctors described as a minor stroke that had caused her temporary loss of consciousness. The medical staff had credited Officer Torres's quick response and proper positioning of the patient with preventing any complications that might have occurred if she had remained on the bathroom floor for an extended period. Mrs. Kellerman had remained in the hospital for 3 days while doctors conducted the tests necessary to determine the extent of her stroke and develop an appropriate treatment plan. Officer Torres had visited her during his off-duty hours, bringing flowers from his own garden and spending time talking with her about her experience and her gratitude for the help she had received. The report included a follow-up section documenting Officer Torres's check on Mrs. Kellerman's house during her hospitalization, ensuring that her property remained secure and that no problems developed during her absence. He had worked with her son to arrange for someone to collect her mail, water her plants, and maintain the household routines that had given structure to her daily life for so many years. Mrs. Kellerman had returned home with arrangements for daily visits from a home health aide and twice-weekly appointments with a physical therapist who would help her regain the strength and balance that had been affected by her stroke. Officer Torres had made several informal visits during his patrol rounds, checking to ensure that she was adjusting well to these changes and that the support services were meeting her needs effectively. Lieutenant Walsh found herself deeply moved by the thoroughness and humanity that Officer Torres had brought to what might have been handled as a simple medical emergency call. His report demonstrated the kind of comprehensive police work that recognized the connection between law enforcement and community care, understanding that protecting citizens involved much more than simply responding to criminal activity. She turned to the next report in the stack, this one documenting a fraud investigation that had required months of patient detective work to unravel. Detective Lisa Park had been assigned to investigate complaints from several elderly residents who had been contacted by phone by someone claiming to represent their bank and requesting verification of their account information. The initial complaint had come from Mrs. Helen Wong, an 83-year-old widow who had received a call from someone identifying himself as James Patterson from the security department of First National Bank. The caller had explained that suspicious activity had been detected on her account and that immediate verification of her personal information was necessary to prevent unauthorized access to her funds. Mrs. Wong had provided her social security number, birth date, and account information to the caller, only realizing later that the bank would never request such information over the phone. When she called the bank to report her concerns, she learned that no employee named James Patterson worked in their security department, and that no suspicious activity had been detected on her account. Detective Park had begun her investigation by interviewing Mrs. Wong in detail about the phone call, documenting not just the factual information about what had been said, but also her impressions of the caller's voice, manner of speaking, and the specific language he had used to convince her to provide her personal information. Mrs. Wong described the caller as having a pleasant voice with what she thought might have been a slight regional accent, possibly from the South, though she acknowledged that she might have been influenced by the courteous manner that had initially convinced her that the call was legitimate. The caller had known her full name and address, information that had helped convince her that he was indeed calling from her bank. Detective Park had immediately contacted First National Bank to alert them about the fraud attempt and to discuss procedures for protecting Mrs. Wong's account from unauthorized access. The bank had agreed to monitor the account closely and to implement additional security measures that would prevent anyone from accessing Mrs. Wong's funds without her physical presence at the bank. The investigation had expanded when Detective Park learned that Mrs. Wong was not the only elderly person in the community who had received similar calls. Over the following weeks, she documented complaints from 5 other residents, all of them over 70 years old, all of them contacted by someone claiming to represent their bank or credit card company. Mr. Robert Chun had received a call supposedly from his credit card company, claiming that his card had been used to make suspicious purchases and that immediate verification was necessary to prevent additional fraud. Like Mrs. Wong, Mr. Chun had provided personal information before realizing that legitimate companies do not conduct business in this manner. Mrs. Dorothy Sullivan had been contacted by someone claiming to represent Medicare, explaining that new regulations required verification of her personal information to ensure continued coverage. The caller had been particularly convincing, demonstrating knowledge of recent Medicare policy changes that made his explanation seem plausible. Detective Park had approached each case with the same methodical attention to detail, documenting not just the factual information about each call, but also analyzing the patterns that might help identify the person or persons responsible for the fraud attempts. She had noted that all of the calls had been made during daytime hours when elderly residents were most likely to be home and alert enough to engage in conversation. The caller had consistently demonstrated knowledge of personal information that suggested access to databases containing names, addresses, and possibly even bank affiliations for the targeted victims. Detective Park had worked with federal authorities to determine whether the fraud attempts were part of a larger operation targeting elderly residents across multiple states. Her investigation had revealed that similar calls were being reported in communities throughout the region, suggesting an organized effort rather than the random criminal activity that local police departments were equipped to handle independently. Detective Park had coordinated with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to share information and develop strategies for identifying and prosecuting the individuals responsible for the fraud scheme. Breakthrough in the case had come through what Detective Park described as a combination of technological assistance and old-fashioned police work. Working with phone company security specialists, she had been able to trace several of the fraudulent calls to a calling center operating from a rented office space in a neighboring state. The calling center had been staffed by individuals using scripts designed to convince elderly victims to provide personal information that could later be used to access their financial accounts. Detective Park's report included copies of these scripts, which demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the psychological techniques that could be used to manipulate vulnerable people, the individuals operating. The calling center had obtained lists of elderly residents from sources that remained unclear, though Detective Park's investigation suggested that they might have purchased information from companies that compiled marketing databases targeting seniors. The sophistication of the operation indicated professional criminal organization rather than the amateur attempts that local police departments encountered more commonly. Detective Park had worked with federal agents to coordinate surveillance of the calling center, documenting the daily activities of the individuals who worked there and gathering evidence that could be used to support criminal charges. The investigation had required several months of patient observation and evidence gathering before authorities felt confident that they had identified all of the participants in the fraud scheme. The arrests had been coordinated to occur simultaneously at multiple locations, preventing any of the suspects from destroying evidence or alerting others who might have been involved in the operation. Detective Park had participated in the arrest at the calling center, helping to secure computers and documents that contained evidence of the fraud scheme's scope and methodology. Case had concluded with convictions for all 7 individuals who had been arrested in connection with the fraud scheme. Detective Park's report noted that the sentences had included both prison time and requirements for restitution to the victims, who had suffered financial losses as a result of the criminal activity. More importantly, the investigation had led to the development of educational programs designed to help elderly residents recognize and avoid similar fraud attempts in the future. Detective Park had worked with local senior citizen organizations to present information about common fraud schemes and the techniques that criminals use to manipulate their victims. The report included documentation of Detective Park's follow-up visits with each of the local victims, ensuring that they had recovered from any financial losses and that they felt confident about their ability to recognize and avoid future fraud attempts. Mrs. Wong had expressed particular gratitude for the patient way that Detective Park had handled her case, noting that she had felt embarrassed about being victimized but had been treated with respect and understanding throughout the investigation. Lieutenant Walsh found Detective Park's approach to the fraud case exemplary in its combination of technical, investigative skills, and human sensitivity. The detective had recognized that elderly fraud victims often experienced shame and self-doubt, in addition to their financial losses, and she had taken care to address these emotional needs while pursuing the criminal investigation. The next report in the stack dealt with a vandalism case that had required a different kind of patience and creativity. Officer David Kim had been assigned to investigate a series of incidents in which someone had been damaging property at Lincoln Elementary School, breaking windows and spray painting graffiti on the building's exterior walls. The vandalism had occurred over a period of several weeks, always during weekend hours when the school was empty and security patrols were minimal. Principal Mary Rodriguez had expressed frustration with the ongoing damage, noting that repair costs were beginning to strain the school's maintenance budget and that the vandalism was creating a negative atmosphere that affected both students and staff. Officer Kim had begun his investigation by conducting a thorough examination of the school property, documenting the location and nature of each vandalism incident. The damage appeared to be random, with no obvious pattern in the selection of targets or the type of destruction that had been inflicted. Windows had been broken using rocks that appeared to have been thrown from the parking lot, suggesting that the vandal was working at some distance from the building rather than approaching closely enough to risk being seen by neighbors or passing motorists. The graffiti had been applied using spray paint in colors that suggested the vandal had access to multiple cans of paint rather than simply using whatever materials happened to be available. Officer Kim had interviewed neighbors whose homes overlooked the school property, seeking information about any unusual activity they might have observed during the times when the vandalism was likely to have occurred. Mrs. Patterson, whose backyard bordered the school playground, reported hearing what might have been breaking glass on 2 different Saturday nights, though she had not investigated the sounds at the time. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, who lived across the street from the school, had noticed a bicycle parked in the school parking lot on several occasions when the building should have been empty. They had assumed that the bicycle belonged to a maintenance worker or someone with legitimate business at the school. but the timing of their observations corresponded with the estimated times of several vandalism incidents. Investigation had expanded to include interviews with local business owners who sold spray paint, seeking information about any unusual purchases that might be connected to the vandalism. Hardware store owner Bill Morrison had noted that someone had recently purchased several cans of spray paint in colors that matched the graffiti at the school, paying in cash and declining to provide identification for the purchase. Mr. Morrison's description of the customer matched that of a teenage boy, approximately 15 or 16 years old, who had seemed nervous during the transaction and had left quickly without engaging in the kind of casual conversation that characterized most interactions in the small store. The purchase had occurred on a Friday afternoon, one day before another vandalism incident at the school. Officer Kim had worked with school officials to identify students who might have reasons to target the school property, though Principal Rodriguez had emphasized that the investigation should be conducted carefully to avoid creating an atmosphere of suspicion that would damage relationships between students and staff. The breakthrough in the case had come through community observation rather than formal investigation techniques. Mrs. Patterson had decided to watch more carefully for any activity around the school after learning about Officer Kim's investigation, and she had observed someone climbing over the fence that separated the school property from the neighborhood on a Saturday evening. Rather than confronting the individual directly, Mrs. Patterson had called Officer Kim, who had arrived quickly enough to observe the vandalism in progress. The suspect was indeed a teenage boy, later identified as 16-year-old Marcus Thompson, who was attempting to break another window when Officer Kim approached. Marcus had not attempted to flee when confronted by Officer Kim, instead appearing relieved that his activities had finally been discovered. The arrest had been conducted with minimal drama, with Marcus cooperating fully and expressing what appeared to be genuine remorse for the damage he had caused to the school property. Officer Kim's report included detailed documentation of his conversation with Marcus following the arrest, revealing that the vandalism had been motivated by frustration with academic struggles rather than any desire to cause random destruction. Marcus had been failing several classes and felt overwhelmed by expectations that he was unable to meet, leading to anger that he had directed toward the school building itself. The case had been resolved through what Officer Kim described as a restorative justice approach that focused on repairing the damage and addressing the underlying issues that had motivated the vandalism. Marcus had been required to pay for the repairs to the school property through a combination of his own money and community service work. More importantly, the resolution had included connecting Marcus with tutoring resources and counseling services that addressed his academic struggles and provided him with more constructive ways to deal with his frustration. Officer Kim had worked with school officials to ensure that Marcus received the support he needed to improve his academic performance and develop better coping strategies for dealing with stress. Principal Rodriguez had reported 6 months later that Marcus had shown significant improvement in both his academic performance and his attitude toward school, suggesting that the patient, comprehensive approach to resolving the vandalism case had succeeded in addressing not just the immediate criminal behavior, but also the underlying problems that had motivated it. Lieutenant Walsh found Officer Kim's handling of the vandalism case representative of the thoughtful approach that characterized much of the police work documented in these reports. Rather than simply processing Marcus through the juvenile justice system, Officer Kim had taken the time to understand the motivations behind the criminal behavior and work with other professionals to develop a solution that addressed the root causes of the problem. The final report in her evening's reading dealt with a missing person case that had tested the patience and investigative skills of Detective Robert Wong over a period of several months. The case had begun when Mrs. Catherine Williams had contacted police to report that her adult daughter, 20-8-year-old Jennifer Williams, had not been in contact with her family for more than 2 weeks. Jennifer Williams lived independently in an apartment across town from her parents, working as a nurse at the regional medical center and maintaining what Mrs. Williams described as regular contact with her family through weekly phone calls and monthly visits for dinner. The absence of communication was completely out of character and had prompted growing concern among family members. Detective Wong had begun his investigation by visiting Jennifer's apartment, working with the building manager to gain access when repeated knocking had produced no response. The apartment had been neat and orderly, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Though Detective Wong had noted that several personal items that Jennifer would normally carry with her were missing from their usual locations. Jennifer's car was not in its assigned parking space, and her neighbors reported that they had not seen her for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. Mail had accumulated in her mailbox, and her employer had reported that she had not appeared for scheduled shifts without calling to explain her absence. Behavior that was completely uncharacteristic for someone who had been described as extremely reliable. Detective Wong had contacted Jennifer's supervisor at the medical center, learning that she had been dealing with significant stress related to her work caring for terminally ill patients. The supervisor, Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, had noted that Jennifer had seemed increasingly withdrawn in recent weeks. Though she had not expressed any specific concerns or requested time off to address her emotional needs, the investigation had included interviews with Jennifer's co-workers, who described her as dedicated and compassionate but acknowledged that she had been showing signs of what they recognized as burnout. Several nurses mentioned that Jennifer had been working extra shifts to help cover staffing shortages, potentially contributing to the stress that might have influenced her decision to leave without notice. Detective Wong had also interviewed Jennifer's friends, seeking information about her recent activities and emotional state that might provide clues about where she might have gone or why she might have chosen to leave without contacting her family. Most of her friends described her as responsible and family-oriented, making her unexplained absence particularly concerning. The investigation had expanded to include checks with hospitals, police departments, and social service agencies in surrounding states, seeking any information about Jennifer or her vehicle that might indicate where she had gone. Detective Wong had also contacted the National Crime Information Center to enter information about Jennifer and her car into databases that would alert law enforcement agencies throughout the country if she came to their attention. After 6 weeks of investigation with no significant leads, Detective Wong had begun to explore the possibility that Jennifer's disappearance might be connected to her work at the medical center. He had learned that she had been caring for several patients with terminal illnesses and had recently experienced the death of a patient to whom she had become particularly attached. Mrs. Carter had explained that healthcare workers sometimes experienced what professionals called compassion fatigue, a form of emotional exhaustion that could lead to depression, anxiety, and sometimes to the kind of emotional crisis that might prompt someone to abandon their regular life without warning. The breakthrough in the case had come through what Detective Wong described as persistent but patient investigation rather than any dramatic discovery. He had continued to check regularly with law enforcement agencies throughout the region, and after 2 months, he had received a call from police in a small town in Northern California where Jennifer's car had been found abandoned in a hospital parking lot. Local police had traced the car to Jennifer, who was working as a volunteer nurse at a free clinic that served homeless and indigent patients. She had been living in a small apartment under an assumed name, having left her previous life because she felt overwhelmed by the emotional demands of her work and unable to cope with the expectations of her family and friends. Detective Wong had traveled to California to speak with Jennifer personally, working to understand her emotional state and her intentions regarding her family back home. His report documented their conversation with sensitivity and understanding, recognizing that Jennifer's disappearance had been motivated by psychological distress rather than any desire to cause pain to her loved ones. Jennifer had explained that she had felt trapped by the expectations that surrounded her work as a nurse, constantly confronted with suffering that she was unable to alleviate and death that she was powerless to prevent. The emotional weight of these experiences had gradually eroded her ability to cope with the normal stresses of life, leading to a crisis that had prompted her impulsive decision to leave everything behind. Detective Wong had worked with Jennifer and her family to arrange for her return home, connecting her with mental health professionals who could help her address the burnout and depression that had motivated her disappearance. He had also worked with her employer to arrange for a leave of absence that would allow her time to recover without fear of losing her job. The case had concluded with Jennifer's successful return to her family and her eventual return to work at the medical center, though in a different capacity that was less emotionally demanding. Detective Wong's report noted that she had expressed gratitude for the patient, understanding way that he had handled the investigation, particularly his recognition that her disappearance had been motivated by emotional distress rather than criminal intent. Mrs. Williams had written a letter of appreciation that was included in the case file, thanking Detective Wong for his persistence in finding her daughter and his sensitivity in handling what she recognized had been a mental health crisis rather than a criminal matter. The letter noted that the family had learned important lessons about recognizing and addressing the signs of emotional distress before they reached crisis levels. Lieutenant Walsh found Detective Wong's handling of the missing person case exemplary in its combination of thorough investigative technique and human understanding. The detective had recognized that Jennifer's disappearance was likely motivated by emotional distress rather than external threats, and he had conducted his investigation with the patience and sensitivity that such cases required. These reports represented hours of careful documentation, thousands of words typed on machines that required physical effort to operate, creating permanent records that captured not just the facts of each case, but also the humanity of the officers who had handled them. Each report demonstrated the kind of police work that recognized that law enforcement was fundamentally about serving people, protecting communities, and addressing the complex social problems that generated the incidents that came to police attention. The building around Lieutenant Walsh had settled into its deepest quiet, the rhythm of the night shift creating a peaceful background to her reading. These reports reminded her why she had chosen police work as a career, why the patient, thoughtful approach to serving communities remained as important now as it had been when these cases were investigated and documented. With such care, the dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that filtered through the basement window, creating patterns that shifted and dissolved like memories themselves. Archivist Margaret Chun moved through the deepest section of the records, storage with the careful reverence of someone who understood that she was walking among the dreams and nightmares of thousands of people, all reduced now to manila folders and fading ink. This section of the archives had been sealed for more than 15 years, opened only when specific cases required historical research or when families sought closure on events that had shaped their lives decades earlier. The air here carried the particular scent of old paper and metal filing cabinets, a smell that spoke of time passing slowly in stories, waiting patiently to be remembered. Margaret paused before cabinet section M, running her hand along the metal surface that had been painted institutional green sometime in the 1960s. The paint had chipped in places, revealing the gray primer beneath, creating an abstract pattern that seemed to map the passage of years through this underground repository of human experience. These cabinets contained cases from the 1970s, an era when police work had been conducted at a different pace, with different tools. and with a different understanding of the relationship between law enforcement and the Kakotut communities they served. She pulled open drawer M47, feeling the heavy resistance of metal runners that had not been disturbed for years. Inside, folders hung in perfect rows, each one labeled with the careful handwriting that had been the standard for police documentation before computers transformed the way information was recorded and stored. The cases here had been closed for decades, their urgent questions answered, their mysteries solved. Their participants long since moved on to other chapters of their lives. The first file she withdrew was labeled Case Number 741127, Residential Burglary 823, Maple Avenue. The folder felt substantial in her hands, thick with reports and photographs that documented an investigation from the autumn of 1974. Opening it carefully, she found herself looking at black and white photographs of a modest two-story house surrounded by mature oak trees whose leaves had been captured in mid-fall, creating a carpet of organic shapes across the front yard. Detective James Morrison had been assigned to investigate the burglary at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Harold Peterson, a retired couple who had lived at the same address for more than 20 years. The initial report, written in the careful block letters that characterized police documentation from that era, described how the Petersons had returned from a weekend visit to their daughter's family to find their back door standing open and several rooms in obvious disarray. Burglars had been systematic in their approach, focusing on items that could be easily transported and quickly sold. Mrs. Peterson's jewelry box had been emptied, leaving behind only a few pieces that apparently held sentimental rather than monetary value. Mr. Peterson's coin collection, accumulated over 30 years of casual collecting, had been taken in its entirety, along with a camera that he had purchased to document family gatherings and neighborhood events. Detective Morrison had documented the crime scene with the methodical thoroughness that characterized police work from that period. His photographs captured not just the obvious signs of the break-in, but also the subtle details that revealed how the Petersons had lived their daily lives. Their living room showed the comfortable wear patterns of furniture that had been chosen for durability and comfort rather than fashion, arranged to facilitate conversation and shared activities rather than mere display. The kitchen, where the burglars had searched through drawers and cabinets, revealed the organized efficiency of people who had spent decades perfecting their domestic routines. Mrs. Peterson had arranged her spices alphabetically, her cooking utensils sorted by function and frequency of use, her canned goods organized in a way that suggested someone who planned meals carefully and shopped with deliberate attention to both nutrition and economy. Detective Morrison's investigation had extended beyond the immediate crime scene to include interviews with neighbors who might have observed suspicious activity during the weekend when the Petersons had been away. Mrs. Dorothy Kim, who lived next door and had known the Petersons since they moved into the neighborhood, had noticed a van parked in the alley behind their house on Saturday afternoon, but had assumed it belonged to someone making a delivery or conducting repairs. Mr. Frank Rodriguez, whose kitchen window overlooked the Petersons' backyard, had heard what sounded like someone hammering on wood around midday on Saturday, but had dismissed it as normal weekend home maintenance activity. The sound had lasted only a few minutes and had not been repeated, so he had not investigated further or thought to mention it to anyone until Detective Morrison's investigation brought it to his attention. The investigation had revealed patterns that connected the Peterson burglary to two similar crimes that had occurred throughout the neighborhood over the previous month. Detective Morrison had identified what he described as a systematic approach to residential burglary that suggested professional criminals rather than opportunistic theft. The burglars had consistently targeted houses whose occupants were away for extended periods, had focused on portable valuable items, and had shown knowledge of neighborhoods that indicated careful observation and planning. Working with Detective Sarah Williams, who had been assigned to investigate the other burglaries in the area, Detective Morrison had developed a profile of the criminal operation that included at least 3 people working together. One person appeared to be responsible for surveillance, identifying houses whose occupants were away and determining the best approach for entry. A second person had the skills necessary to defeat locks and security measures without causing excessive noise or damage. The third person seemed to function as a driver and lookout, ensuring that the operation could be conducted quickly and safely. The breakthrough in the case had come through what the reports described as patient observation, combined with community cooperation. Detective Morrison had worked with neighborhood residents to establish an informal watch system, encouraging people to pay attention to unusual vehicles and unfamiliar faces without creating an atmosphere of paranoia that would damage the sense of community that made the neighborhood attractive to its residents. Mrs. Elizabeth Turner, whose house provided a view of several other properties in the area, had called police when she observed the same van that Mrs. Kim had seen behind the Petersons' house, now parked near another residence whose occupants she knew to be away on vacation. Detective Morrison had responded immediately, arriving in time to observe 3 men removing items from the house through a back door that showed obvious signs of forced entry. The arrest had been made without incident, with all 3 suspects surrendering peacefully when confronted by police. Detective Morrison's report noted that the men had been cooperative during questioning, apparently relieved that their criminal activities had finally been discovered. They had confessed to more than 20 burglaries throughout the city, providing information that allowed police to recover stolen property and return it to victims who had resigned themselves to permanent losses. The case file included photographs of the recovered items, arranged on tables in the police station's evidence room, like the inventory of a small store. Mrs. Peterson's jewelry had been found in a storage locker that the burglars had rented under false names, still in the original jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother. Mr. Peterson's coin collection had been intact, the burglars having been unable to find a buyer who would purchase the entire collection without asking questions about its provenance. Margaret found herself moved by the care that had been taken to document not just the crime but also its resolution and the impact it had on the victims. Detective Morrison had included in his final report a description of his visit to return the Petersons' property, noting their gratitude and relief at recovering items that held sentimental value far beyond their monetary worth. Mrs. Peterson had been particularly emotional about the return of her grandmother's jewelry box, explaining to Detective Morrison that it contained not just jewelry but also letters and small mementos that connected her to family members who had died many years earlier. The box had been a physical link to her personal history, and its loss had felt like losing a part of her identity that could never be replaced. Mr. Peterson had expressed similar feelings about his coin collection, not because of its value as an investment, but because each coin represented a specific memory or moment in his life. He had acquired many of the coins during travels with his wife, others had been gifts from friends and family members, and some had been purchased to commemorate important events in their lives together. The collection was a tangible autobiography, and its recovery had restored a piece of his life that had seemed permanently lost. The case file concluded with letters from several of the burglary victims, expressing their appreciation for the thorough investigation and their gratitude for the recovery of their property. The letters painted a picture of a community that had been wounded by the violations of privacy and security that the burglaries represented, but had been healed through the patient, professional police work that had brought the criminals to justice. Margaret carefully returned the Peterson file to its place and selected another folder, this one dealing with a missing child case that had mobilized the entire police department during the summer of 1973, the file was thicker than most, documenting an investigation that had consumed thousands of hours of police time and had engaged the entire community in a search that had tested everyone's endurance and faith. 8-year-old Timothy Walsh had disappeared from his family's backyard on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in July, vanishing sometime during the hour between his mother's last check on him and his scheduled return to the house for lunch. Mrs. Patricia Walsh had found the yard empty, Timothy's bicycle abandoned beside the sandbox where he had been playing with toy trucks just an hour earlier. The initial response had been immediate and comprehensive, with every available officer assigned to search the neighborhood while detectives began the careful process of documenting the circumstances of Timothy's disappearance. Sergeant Robert Kim had been designated as the lead investigator, coordinating the efforts of patrol officers, detectives, and volunteers who had immediately offered to help with the search. The police reports documented the systematic approach that had been taken to search every possible location where an 8-year-old boy might have wandered or hidden. Officers had checked every house in a 6-block radius, looking in basements, attics, garages, and storage buildings where Timothy might have gotten trapped or lost. They had searched the nearby woods with dogs, dragged the pond in the city park, and checked every abandoned building or construction site where a curious child might have encountered danger. Detective Lisa Park had been assigned to investigate the possibility that Timothy's disappearance was the result of criminal activity rather than an accident. Her reports documented interviews with every adult who lived or worked in the neighborhood, seeking anyone who might have observed suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar people in the area. Around the time of Timothy's disappearance, the investigation had revealed nothing alarming in Timothy's family life or immediate environment. Mr. and Mrs. Walsh were described by neighbors and teachers as loving, responsible parents who provided appropriate supervision and care for their children. Timothy was described as an intelligent, well-behaved child who understood basic safety rules and was not given to wandering away from home without permission. As the search extended into its second day, the police department had organized a more comprehensive effort that included volunteers from throughout the community. Detective Park's reports documented the coordination required to manage more than 200 volunteers who had offered to help search areas that regular police patrols might have missed. Volunteers had been organized into teams led by experienced officers, each team assigned to search specific areas, using systematic patterns that would ensure complete coverage without duplication of effort. The search had included not just obvious locations like parks and wooded areas, but also less likely possibilities like storm drains, construction sites, and even the roofs of tall buildings, where a child might have climbed and become stranded. Margaret found photographs documenting the search effort, images that captured the intensity of community concern that had motivated so many people to abandon their regular activities and join the effort to find Timothy Walsh. The photograph showed people of all ages working together, their faces reflecting the shared anxiety that had gripped the entire neighborhood. The breakthrough in the case had come on the third day, when a volunteer searcher had heard faint sounds coming from an abandoned well that had been covered with wooden boards and forgotten in a patch of woods behind the old Thompson farm. Timothy had fallen through the rotted boards while exploring the woods, landing in the dry well shaft where he'd been trapped for more than 60 hours. Fire department rescue specialists had worked for several hours to extract Timothy from the well shaft, using equipment and techniques that required careful coordination to avoid causing a collapse that might have injured the trapped child. Detective Park's report described the delicate operation with the precision that characterized all police documentation from that era. Timothy had survived his ordeal with only minor injuries, though he had been severely dehydrated and frightened by his experience. The hospital had kept him for observation for several days while he recovered from his physical ordeal and began to process the emotional trauma of being trapped alone. Darkness for so long. The case file included documentation of the steps that had been taken to ensure that similar accidents could not occur in the future. City officials had organized a comprehensive survey of the area to identify and secure other abandoned wells or dangerous structures that might pose threats to curious children. Property owners had been required to properly secure or fill any wells or excavations on their land that could present safety hazards. Detective Park had also worked with school officials to develop safety education programs that would teach children to recognize and avoid dangerous situations without creating excessive fear or anxiety. The programs had emphasized the importance of staying in familiar areas and immediately reporting any dangerous conditions they might encounter during their play. The Walsh family had expressed profound gratitude for the efforts of everyone who had participated in the search for Timothy. Mrs. Walsh had written a letter that was included in the case file, thanking not just the police officers and rescue workers, but also the hundreds of volunteers who had given their time and energy to help find her son. The letter described how the community response to Timothy's disappearance had demonstrated the bonds of mutual support that connected neighbors who might not otherwise have had opportunities to work together toward a common goal. The crisis had revealed the depth of care that people felt for each other's children and their willingness to mobilize quickly when someone needed help. Margaret found herself deeply moved by the documentation of community response that filled much of the case file. The police reports captured not just the technical aspects of the search and rescue operation, but also the human dimension of a community that had come together to protect one of its most vulnerable members. She selected another file, this one dealing with a case of elder abuse that had required delicate investigation and intervention. The case had begun when Mrs. Dorothy Chen, an 84-year-old widow, had been brought to the hospital emergency room by her adult grandson with injuries that medical staff found suspicious. Detective Michael Torres had been assigned to investigate the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Chun's injuries, which included bruises on her arms and back that appeared to be in various stages of healing, suggesting a pattern of ongoing physical abuse rather than a single incident. The investigation had required the kind of patient sensitive approach that elder abuse cases demanded. Mrs. Chen had initially been reluctant to discuss how she had been injured, telling hospital staff and police that she had fallen down the stairs in her house. However, the pattern and location of her injuries were not consistent with a fall, and her obvious fear when her grandson attempted to speak for her had raised additional concerns among the medical staff who had treated her. Detective Torres had arranged for Mrs. Chun to be interviewed privately, away from her grandson and other family members who might have been influencing her willingness to discuss her situation honestly. The interview had been conducted with the assistance of a social worker who specialized in elder abuse cases and could help Mrs. Chun understand her options and rights. During the private interview, Mrs. Chun had revealed that she had been living with her grandson and his wife for more than 2 years, having moved in with them when she became unable to live independently. Initially, the arrangement had worked well, but over time her grandson had become increasingly impatient with her physical limitations and had begun pushing and grabbing her when he became frustrated with her needs for assistance. The abuse had escalated gradually, with Mrs. Chun's grandson becoming more physically aggressive when he was stressed about work or money. Mrs. Chun had been afraid to report the Abuse because she had nowhere else to live and was dependent on her grandson for basic care and support. She had also felt ashamed that her own family member was treating her poorly and had hoped that the situation would improve without outside intervention. Detective Torres had worked with social services to develop a safety plan for Mrs. Chun that would protect her from further abuse while also addressing her legitimate needs for housing and care. The investigation had revealed that Mrs. Chun was entitled to benefits and services that could support her living independently with appropriate assistance. Options that she had not known were available to her. The case had been resolved through what Detective Torres described as a therapeutic rather than purely punitive approach. Mrs. Chun's grandson had been required to attend counseling sessions that addressed anger management and caregiver stress, while Mrs. Chun had been moved to an assisted living facility where she could receive appropriate care in a safe environment. The investigation had also led to the identification of systemic problems in the way elder care services were coordinated and publicized in the community. Detective Torres had worked with social service agencies to develop better outreach programs that would inform elderly residents and their families about available resources and support services. Mrs. Chun had written a letter 6 months after her case was resolved, expressing gratitude for the sensitive way that Detective Torres had handled her situation. She reported that she was happy in her new living arrangement and had developed friendships with other residents of the assisted living facility. Her relationship with her grandson had improved after he had received counseling and was no longer under the stress of being her primary caregiver. The case file included documentation of policy changes that had been implemented as a result of Mrs. Chun's case and similar investigations. The police department had developed specialized training for officers who responded to elder abuse reports, emphasizing the unique challenges that elderly victims faced and the importance of connecting them with appropriate social services. Margaret found Detective Torres's handling of the elder abuse case representative of the holistic approach that seemed to characterize much of the police work documented in these older files. The investigation had addressed not just the immediate criminal behavior, but also the underlying social and economic factors that had contributed to the abusive situation. She pulled another file, this one documenting a drug-related case from 1976 that had required months of investigation to unravel. Detective Paul Wong had been assigned to investigate reports of drug dealing in the parking lot of Washington High School, a situation that had caused considerable concern among parents and school officials. The investigation had been complicated by the need to protect the school environment while gathering evidence about criminal activity that was allegedly taking place on school property. Detective Wong had worked closely with school administrators to develop an approach that would address the drug problem without creating an atmosphere of suspicion that would damage the educational mission of the school. Initial surveillance had confirmed that drug transactions were indeed taking place in the school parking lot, typically during lunch periods when students were allowed to leave campus for meals. The dealers appeared to be older teenagers or young adults who were not enrolled in the school but were using the parking lot as a convenient location for conducting business with student customers. Detective Wong had documented the systematic approach he had taken to identify the individuals involved in the drug dealing operation, rather than making immediate arrests that might have disrupted the operation without eliminating its leadership. He had conducted patient observation over several weeks to understand the full scope of the criminal network. The investigation had revealed that the drug dealing operation was more sophisticated than initially apparent, involving several adults who were using teenage distributors to sell Drugs not just at Washington High School, but at several schools throughout the district. The operation had been carefully organized to minimize the risk of detection while maximizing profits from sales to teenage customers. Detective Wong had coordinated with federal drug enforcement officials to ensure that his investigation would contribute to a comprehensive effort to dismantle the entire operation rather than simply displacing it to other locations. The coordination had required careful timing to ensure that arrests were made simultaneously at multiple locations. The arrests had been conducted during school hours to minimize the disruption to educational activities, while ensuring that the maximum number of participants in the drug operation could be apprehended. Detective Wong's reports documented the care that had been taken to conduct the operation in a way that protected student safety while effectively ending the drug dealing that had been contaminating the school environment. The case had concluded with convictions for all of the adults involved in the drug dealing operation, along with appropriate interventions for the teenage students who had been recruited as distributors. Detective Wong had worked with school counselors to ensure that the student participants received counseling and support rather than purely punitive responses that might have damaged their future prospects. The investigation had also led to the implementation of improved security measures at schools throughout the district, including better supervision of parking areas and coordination between school administrators and law enforcement officials. The measures had been designed to prevent future drug dealing operations while maintaining the open, welcoming atmosphere that schools needed to fulfill their educational mission. Margaret found the drug case file representative of the complex investigations that required police to work within sensitive environments like schools while addressing serious criminal activity that threatened community safety. Detective Wong's patient approach had achieved comprehensive results while protecting the institutional interests that needed to be preserved. The final file in her evening's reading dealt with a case of domestic violence that had required ongoing intervention over a period of several months. The case had begun when neighbors had called police to report loud arguments and sounds of violence coming from the apartment of Mr. and Mrs. David Sullivan, a young couple who had recently moved into the building. Officer Elizabeth Park had responded to the initial call, finding Mrs. Sullivan with obvious signs of physical abuse, but reluctant to discuss what had happened or to press charges against her husband. The situation had required the kind of patient, persistent approach that domestic violence cases typically demanded. Officer Park had recognized that Mrs. Sullivan's reluctance to report her husband's abuse was typical of domestic violence situations, where victims often faced complex emotional, financial, and social pressures that made them hesitant to seek help from law enforcement. The officer had provided Mrs. Sullivan with information about resources and support services, while respecting her immediate decision not to pursue criminal charges. The case file documented Officer Park's efforts to maintain contact with Mrs. Sullivan over the following weeks, checking on her welfare and providing ongoing information about options for protecting herself and her children from further violence. The approach had required balancing Mrs. Sullivan's autonomy with the officer's professional obligation to protect victims of domestic violence. The situation had escalated when Mrs. Sullivan had called police herself after her husband had threatened her with a kitchen knife during an argument about money. Officer Park had responded immediately, arresting Mr. Sullivan and ensuring that Mrs. Sullivan and her children were safely relocated to a domestic violence shelter. The investigation had revealed a pattern of escalating abuse that had been occurring for several years, beginning with verbal intimidation and progressing to physical violence that had become increasingly severe over time. Mrs. Sullivan had remained in the relationship because she had been economically dependent on her husband and had believed his promises that his behavior would improve. Officer Park had worked with domestic violence advocates to develop a comprehensive safety plan for Mrs. Sullivan that addressed both her immediate need for protection and her long-term goals for independence. The plan had included assistance with finding employment, securing housing, and obtaining legal protection. Through restraining orders and divorce proceedings, Mr. Sullivan had been prosecuted for domestic violence charges and had been required to attend batterer intervention programs as a condition of his eventual probation. The case file included documentation of Officer Park's follow-up contacts with Mrs. Sullivan to ensure that the protective measures were working effectively and that she felt safe in her new living situation. 6 months after the case was resolved, Mrs. Sullivan had written to thank Officer Park for the patience and understanding she had shown during the difficult process of leaving an abusive relationship. The letter described how the officer's consistent support had given her the confidence to take steps to protect herself and her children that she had not felt capable of taking on her own. Margaret found Officer Park's handling of the domestic violence case exemplary in its recognition that such situations required ongoing support rather than simple law enforcement responses. The officer had understood that domestic violence was a complex social problem that required coordination between law enforcement, social services, and community organizations. These files represented thousands of hours of patient police work, investigations that had required officers to understand not just the legal aspects of criminal behavior, but also the social, economic, and psychological factors that contributed to the situations they were asked to address. The cases documented in these archives demonstrated that effective police work often required skills that went far beyond traditional law enforcement training. Margaret carefully returned the files to their proper locations in the cabinet, ensuring that each one was positioned exactly as she had found it. These stories deserve that kind of care, that attention to preservation and order, that would allow future researchers to discover them and learn from the wisdom they contained. The archives around her held thousands more such stories, each one representing a moment when ordinary people had faced extraordinary circumstances and had relied on police officers who understood that their job was not simply to enforce laws, but to protect the complex web of relationships and institutions that made community life possible. Walking back through the rows of filing cabinets, Margaret felt the weight of all the stories contained in this underground repository of human experience. Each cabinet held dreams and nightmares, triumphs and tragedies, all reduced now to carefully documented reports, but representing real lives that had been touched by the patient. Professional work of police officers who understood that their most important tool was not their weapon or their authority, but their ability to understand people and help them find ways to solve the problems that brought chaos into their lives. The marble floors of the old courthouse reflected the pale morning light that filtered through tall windows, creating patterns of illumination that shifted slowly as the sun moved across the sky. Security guard Frank Morrison had walked these halls for more than 20 years, his soft-soled shoes moving silently across surfaces that had been polished smooth by decades of footsteps from judges, lawyers, defendants, and the families whose lives had been shaped by the proceedings that took place in the courtrooms above. This building had served as the county courthouse since 1924, its neoclassical architecture speaking to an era when public buildings were designed to inspire respect for the institutions they housed. The high ceilings, ornate moldings, and carved stone details created an atmosphere of dignity and permanence that seemed to dwarf the human dramas that unfolded within its walls. Frank paused in the main corridor, looking up at the portraits of judges who had presided over cases in this building, their painted faces capturing the gravitas that their positions had required. Judge Margaret Chen, who had served from 1958 to 1985, gazed down with the expression of someone who had spent decades listening to human stories at their most complex and painful moments. Judge Robert Kim, whose tenure had lasted from 1970 to 1992, had been known for his patient approach to difficult cases and his ability to find solutions that served justice while recognizing the human costs that legal proceedings inevitably involved. The courtrooms themselves held their own particular atmosphere of quiet authority. Courtroom A, where the most serious criminal cases had been tried for more than 50 years, maintained the original wooden furnishings that had been crafted by local artisans when the building was constructed. The judge's bench, raised above the rest of the room, commanded respect through its simple dignity rather than ostentation. The jury box, with its 12 chairs arranged in 2 neat rows, had been the site where hundreds of citizens had grappled with questions of guilt and innocence, responsibility and redemption. Frank had observed thousands of proceedings over the years, watching how different people responded to the formal atmosphere of the courtroom and the weight of the decisions being made. Some defendants had appeared overwhelmed by the solemnity of the proceedings, while others had seemed to find comfort in the orderly process that ensured their cases would be heard fairly and completely. Families had filled the gallery seats, their faces reflecting the complex emotions that accompanied legal proceedings that would determine the future of their loved ones. The holding cells in the basement of the courthouse had housed defendants awaiting trial or sentencing, temporary residents of spaces that had been designed for security rather than comfort, but had been maintained with the dignity that even accused individuals deserved. Each cell had been equipped with a narrow bed, a small table, and basic sanitation facilities, creating an environment that was austere but humane. These cells had held a remarkable variety of people over the decades, from individuals accused of minor infractions to those facing serious felony charges. Frank had occasionally spoken with defendants who were waiting in the cells, finding that many of them appreciated the opportunity for conversation that broke the monotony of their confinement and provided human contact during what was often the most stressful period of their lives. The basement corridor that connected the cells to the courtroom elevator had been designed to allow defendants to move between their holding area and the courtroom without passing through public areas of the building. This route had become familiar to Frank during his years of service, a pathway that represented the intersection between the justice system's need for security and its obligation to treat all individuals with basic respect. During his evening rounds, Frank often found himself thinking about the cases that had been resolved in this building, the lives that had been changed by verdicts delivered in the courtrooms above. The building's files contained records of thousands of cases, each one representing a moment when the community had come together to determine how to respond to violations of the social contract that made civilized life possible. One case that had particularly stayed with Frank's memory involved a young man named David Rodriguez who had been charged with burglary after breaking into several houses in his neighborhood during a period when he had been struggling with drug addiction. The case had been tried in Courtroom A during the winter of 1983, with Judge Chun presiding over proceedings that lasted 3 days. Frank had observed the trial from his position at the back of the courtroom, watching how the formal structure of the legal process had gradually revealed the complex circumstances that had led to David's criminal behavior. The prosecutor had presented evidence of the burglaries systematically, documenting the violations of privacy and security that David's actions had caused for his victims. The defense attorney had worked to help the court understand the personal struggles that had motivated David's criminal behavior, including his addiction to drugs that had begun after an injury had left him dependent on prescription pain medication. The attorney had presented evidence of David's efforts to overcome his addiction and his genuine remorse for the harm he had caused to his neighbors and their families. Judge Chun had listened to all of the evidence with the patient attention that had characterized her approach to every case, asking questions that helped clarify important details, and ensuring that all relevant factors were considered before the court reached its decision. The judge's demeanor had conveyed both the seriousness of the charges and her recognition of the human complexity that had brought David before the court. The victims of David's burglaries had been given opportunities to address the court, describing the impact that the crimes had had on their sense of security and their ability to feel safe in their own homes. Their statements had been delivered with dignity rather than vindictiveness, reflecting the community's desire for justice rather than revenge. David's family had also been present throughout the trial, their faces reflecting the pain of watching someone they loved face the consequences of his actions, while also demonstrating their continued support for his efforts to rebuild his life. His mother had testified about the changes she had observed in David since he had begun treatment for his addiction, while his father had spoken about his son's genuine efforts to make amends for his mistakes. The sentencing hearing had taken place several weeks after the conviction, giving Judge Chun time to review all of the information that had been presented and to consider the recommendations of probation officers who had evaluated David's prospects for successful rehabilitation. The sentence had balanced the need for accountability with recognition of David's potential for positive change. David had been sentenced to 18 months in the county jail, followed by 3 years of supervised probation that included requirements for continued drug treatment and community service that would allow him to make practical amends for his crimes. Judge Shun had explained that the sentence was designed to hold David accountable for his actions while providing him with the support and structure he needed to avoid future criminal behavior. Frank had encountered David several times during his incarceration in the courthouse holding cells, finding him to be respectful and genuinely committed to using his time in custody to address the personal problems that had contributed to his criminal behavior. David had participated in educational programs and had worked with counselors to develop strategies for managing his addiction and finding legitimate employment after his release. The case had concluded successfully, with David completing his sentence and probation requirements without any further criminal activity. Frank had occasionally seen him in the community years later, working at a local construction company and apparently living the stable, productive life that Judge Shun had hoped the sentence would make possible. This case had exemplified the courthouse's role as more than simply a place where punishments were imposed, but as an institution where the community worked together to find ways to address criminal behavior while preserving the possibility for redemption and positive change. The building itself had seemed to support this mission through its atmosphere of dignity and respect for the legal process. Frank continued his rounds, moving up the staircase that connected the basement level to the main floor of the courthouse. The stairs were wide and shallow, designed to accommodate the heavy traffic that moved between the different levels of the building throughout the working day. The banister was made of dark wood that had been worn smooth by thousands of hands over the decades. The second floor of the courthouse housed the offices of court personnel, including the clerks who maintained the official records of all proceedings, and the bailiffs who ensured security and order during trials. These offices had been the nerve center of the court system, where the administrative work necessary to support the judicial process had been conducted with quiet efficiency. The clerk's office had been particularly important to the functioning of the court, maintaining files that documented every case that had been processed through the system. These files contained not just the legal documents that recorded official proceedings, but also correspondence, reports, and other materials that provided context for understanding how each case had been resolved. Mrs. Dorothy Kim had served as chief clerk for more than 30 years, overseeing the meticulous record-keeping that ensured the court's decisions were properly documented and preserved for future reference. Her office had been filled with filing cabinets that contained the paper trail of thousands of cases, each file organized with the careful attention to detail that legal proceedings required. Mrs. Kim had taken pride in maintaining records that would allow future researchers to understand not just what decisions had been made, but also the reasoning and circumstances that had influenced those decisions. She had understood that the court's files were more than administrative documents, but were actually a form of institutional memory that preserved the community's efforts to balance justice with mercy over many decades. The courtroom where family court proceedings had been conducted had maintained a different atmosphere from the criminal courtroom, designed to be less intimidating while still preserving the dignity that legal proceedings required. The furniture had been arranged to facilitate communication between families and the court, with a large table where parents, children, and their attorneys could sit together during hearings. Judge Paul Wong had presided over family court for 15 years, handling cases that involved child custody, domestic relations, and juvenile matters that required careful attention to the best interests of children who were often caught in the middle of adult conflicts. His approach had emphasized mediation and problem-solving rather than adversarial proceedings whenever possible. Frank had observed many family court hearings over the years, watching how Judge Wong had worked to help families find solutions that prioritized children's welfare while respecting parents' rights and responsibilities. The proceedings had often been emotional, but the judge's patient demeanor had helped maintain an atmosphere where difficult conversations could take place constructively. One case that had particularly impressed Frank had involved a custody dispute between divorced parents who had been unable to agree on arrangements for their 8-year-old daughter. The case had extended over several months, as Judge Wong had worked with both parents to develop a custody plan that would serve their daughter's needs, while acknowledging both parents' desires to maintain meaningful relationships with their child. Rather than simply imposing a decision based on legal standards, Judge Wong had required both parents to participate in mediation sessions designed to help them communicate more effectively and focus on their daughter's welfare rather than their own grievances against each other. The process had been slow and sometimes frustrating, but it had ultimately produced an agreement that both parents could support. The judge had also appointed a child advocate who had worked specifically to represent the daughter's interests and ensure that her voice was heard in the proceedings that would determine her living arrangements. The advocate had spent time with the child, helping her express her feelings and preferences in age-appropriate ways that could inform the court's decision. The final custody arrangement had included provisions for both parents to maintain regular contact with their daughter while establishing clear guidelines for communication and decision-making that would minimize future conflicts. Judge Wong had also required both parents to participate in co-parenting classes that would help them work together effectively despite their personal differences. Frank had seen the family in the courthouse several times over the following years as they had returned for routine hearings to review and modify the custody arrangement as their daughter's needs had changed. The parents had appeared to develop a more cooperative relationship over time, suggesting that Judge Wong's patient approach had achieved lasting positive results. The juvenile courtroom had been the site of proceedings involving young people who had been charged with criminal offenses or who had been identified as needing protection from abuse or neglect. These cases had required particular sensitivity, as they had involved individuals whose lives were still being formed and who had greater potential for positive change than adult offenders. Judge Sarah Martinez had specialized in juvenile cases for more than a decade, developing expertise in working with young people and their families to address the underlying problems that had contributed to their involvement with the court system. Her approach had emphasized rehabilitation and support rather than punishment, recognizing that most young offenders could be redirected toward positive paths if they received appropriate intervention. Frank had observed that the juvenile courtroom had maintained a less formal atmosphere than the adult criminal court, with furniture arranged to encourage communication rather than to emphasize the authority of the court. Judge Martinez had often spoken directly with young defendants, asking questions that helped her understand their circumstances and motivations rather than simply reviewing the facts of their alleged offenses. One case that had demonstrated Judge Martinez's approach had involved a 14-year-old boy named Michael Thompson who had been charged with vandalism after spray painting graffiti on several buildings downtown. Rather than simply imposing a fine or community service requirement, Judge Martinez had taken time to understand why Michael had engaged in this behavior and what interventions might prevent future problems. The investigation had revealed that Michael was struggling academically and socially at school, feeling disconnected from his peers and unsuccessful in traditional educational activities. His graffiti had represented an attempt to express himself and gain recognition, even if that recognition came through negative attention from authorities. Judge Martinez had worked with school counselors and community organizations to develop a comprehensive plan that addressed Michael's underlying needs while also holding him accountable for the property damage he had caused. The plan had included tutoring to help him improve his academic performance, participation in a legitimate art program where he could develop his artistic interests constructively, and community service that involved cleaning up graffiti and other forms of vandalism. The case had been resolved successfully, with Michael completing all of his requirements and showing significant improvement in both his academic performance and his social adjustment. Judge Martinez had maintained contact with Michael and his family for several years, monitoring his progress and providing ongoing support as he had developed into a responsible young adult. Frank had been impressed by Judge Martinez's ability to see beyond the immediate offense to understand the complex factors that had motivated Michael's behavior. Her approach had required more time and effort than simply processing the case through standard procedures, but it had achieved results that had benefited both Michael and the community that had been affected by his actions. The courthouse building itself had seemed to support this kind of thoughtful, individualized approach to justice through its atmosphere of dignity and reflection. The high ceilings and ornate architecture had created an environment where serious matters could be considered carefully, without the pressure for quick decisions that might have characterized less formal settings. As Frank completed his evening rounds, he reflected on the thousands of cases that had been resolved in this building over the decades of its service to the community. Each courtroom had been the site of human dramas that had tested the community's commitment to justice, fairness, and redemption. The building had provided a stable, dignified setting where these dramas could unfold according to legal procedures that protected everyone's rights, while seeking outcomes that served the broader public interest. The empty corridors and courtrooms held the echoes of all these proceedings, the weight of decisions made and lives changed through the careful application of legal principles to human problems. The building itself had become a repository of the community's evolving understanding of justice, preserving in its physical structure the ideals that had motivated its construction and the wisdom that had been gained through decades of experience in applying those ideals to real situations. Walking through the basement corridor one final time, Frank paused at the heavy door that separated the courthouse from the street beyond. The building behind him had served its community faithfully for more than 70 years, providing a place where the most serious questions of human behavior and social responsibility could be addressed with the care and attention they deserved. The courthouse would continue this service for many years to come, its solid construction and timeless architecture ensuring that future generations would have access to the same kind of dignified, thoughtful legal proceedings that had characterized its past. The building stood as a monument to the community's commitment to the rule of law and its faith in the possibility that justice could be achieved through patient, careful attention to the facts and circumstances that shaped human behavior. Outside, the city continued its restless movement, generating new conflicts and problems that would eventually find their way into the courtrooms upstairs. But the courthouse itself remained stable and unchanging, a source of order and reflection in a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. Its halls and chambers would continue to provide the setting, where the community's highest ideals could be tested against the complex realities of human nature, ensuring that the pursuit of justice would continue with the same dignity and care that had characterized its work for so many years. The street lamps cast their familiar pools of yellow light along Maple Avenue, illuminating the sidewalks where 3 generations of families had walked their children to school, pushed baby strollers during evening constitutionals, and gathered in small groups during summer evenings to share the quiet pleasures of neighborhood life. Community Liaison Officer Patricia Wong had walked these same sidewalks for more than 8 years, her presence becoming as much a part of the neighborhood's rhythm as the mail carrier's daily route or the gentle hum of lawn mowers on Saturday mornings. Tonight, as she made her regular patrol through the residential streets that formed the heart of the Riverside District, Officer Wong reflected on how crime had touched this community not as a series of isolated incidents, but as threads in the complex tapestry of human relationships that made neighborhood life both precious and fragile. Each house she passed held stories of families who had been affected, directly or indirectly, by the criminal activities that had periodically disrupted the peace that residents worked so carefully to maintain. The Martinez family's house sat at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, its front porch light casting a welcoming glow across the small garden that Mrs. Elena Martinez had tended for more than 15 years. The house itself looked exactly as it had for decades, with its white painted siding and green shutters that Mrs. Martinez repainted every few years to maintain the neat appearance that reflected her pride in homeownership and her commitment to the neighborhood's shared standards of care. But Officer Wong knew that the peaceful exterior masked the trauma that the Martinez family had experienced 2 years earlier, when their teenage son, Carlos, had become involved with a group of young people who had been selling drugs at the local high school. The discovery of Carlos's involvement had shattered the family's sense of security and had forced them to confront realities about their son's life that they had not previously understood. Mrs. Martinez had called the police herself when she had found drugs hidden in Carlos's bedroom, a decision that had required enormous courage and had torn at her maternal instincts to protect her child from the consequences of his actions. Officer Wong had responded to that call, beginning a relationship with the Martinez family that had continued through Carlos's arrest, prosecution, and eventual rehabilitation. Case had revealed how drug activity affected not just the individuals directly involved, but entire families and neighborhoods that struggled to understand how to respond to criminal behavior that emerged from their own communities. Carlos had not been a stranger or an outsider, but a young person who had grown up on these streets, attended the local elementary school, and played in the parks that served as gathering places for neighborhood children. Officer Wong had worked with the Martinez family to develop a comprehensive approach to Carlos's situation that addressed both the legal consequences of his actions and the underlying factors that had made him vulnerable to involvement in drug dealing. The approach had required patience from everyone involved, as there had been no quick solutions to problems that had developed over months, and that had roots in complex social and economic pressures affecting many young people in the community. Carlos's involvement with drugs had begun, like many such cases, through a combination of peer pressure and economic opportunity that had seemed attractive to a teenager who had been struggling with school and had felt disconnected from the conventional paths to success that his parents had hoped he would follow. The drug dealing had offered him both social status among certain groups of his peers and income that had made him feel more independent and successful than his academic performance had allowed. The intervention that Officer Wong had helped coordinate had included not just legal proceedings, but also counseling, educational support, and community service that had connected Carlos with positive role models and legitimate opportunities for the kind of recognition and responsibility that he had been seeking through his involvement in illegal activities. The process had required more than a year of sustained effort from Carlos, his family, and various community organizations. Mrs. Martinez had participated in a support group for parents of children involved in drug activities, finding connection with other families who were facing similar challenges and learning strategies for supporting their children while maintaining appropriate boundaries and expectations. The group had met in the basement of St. Mary's Church, creating a safe space where parents could share their fears and frustrations without judgment. Mr. Martinez had worked with Carlos to repair the relationships that had been damaged by his son's criminal activities, including making amends to neighbors who had been affected by the drug dealing that had occurred in their community. These conversations had been difficult, but had ultimately strengthened the family's connections to their neighbors and had demonstrated their commitment to being responsible members of the community. The Martinez family's story had become part of the larger narrative of how the Riverside District had responded to the drug problems that had affected several families during that period. Rather than allowing the criminal activities to divide the community or create an atmosphere of suspicion and fear, residents had worked together to address the underlying conditions that had made young people vulnerable to involvement in illegal activities. Officer Wong continued her patrol, turning onto Cedar Street, where the Chun family lived in a modest two-story house that had been their home for more than 20 years. Mr. and Mrs. Chun had immigrated to the United States when their children were young, working multiple jobs to establish the stable, comfortable life that had allowed their family to become integral members of the neighborhood community. Their daughter Linda had been a victim of identity theft 3 years earlier, a crime that had affected not just her personal finances, but her family's sense of security and their confidence in the systems that were supposed to protect law-abiding citizens. The case had been particularly complex because the identity theft had been committed by someone Linda had trusted, a co-worker who had used his access to personal information to open credit accounts in Linda's name. The discovery of the identity theft had come when Linda had been denied a loan for a car purchase, learning for the first time that her credit history had been damaged by accounts she had never opened and debts she had never incurred. The revelation had been devastating, not just financially, but emotionally, as Linda had struggled to understand how someone she had worked with daily and had considered a friend could have violated her trust so completely. Officer Wong had worked with Linda and her family to navigate the complex process of reporting the identity theft and working with financial institutions to restore Linda's credit and recover the money that had been stolen in her name. The process had required enormous patience, as each fraudulent account had to be disputed individually, and the evidence of theft had to be documented according to the specific requirements of different banks and credit agencies. Investigation had revealed that Linda's co-worker had been stealing personal information from multiple employees, using his position in the company's human resources department to access social security numbers, addresses, and other data that he had needed to open fraudulent accounts. The scope of his criminal activity had eventually encompassed more than 20 victims, making the case significant enough to warrant prosecution as a major financial crime. The prosecution of the identity theft case had taken more than 18 months, during which Linda and her family had lived with the ongoing uncertainty about whether they would be able to fully recover from the financial damage that had been caused by the theft. Officer Wong had maintained regular contact with the Chen family throughout this period, providing updates about the investigation and helping them access resources for victims of financial crimes. The case had concluded with a conviction and a sentence that had included restitution requirements. though the practical process of actually recovering the stolen money had proven more complicated than the legal proceedings. Linda had eventually been able to restore her credit and recover most of the financial losses. But the emotional impact of the violation had lasted much longer than the practical consequences. Mrs. Chun had spoken with Officer Wong about how the identity theft had affected the entire family's sense of security, creating anxiety about sharing personal information and concerns about trusting people outside their immediate family. The crime had been particularly disturbing because it had been committed by someone who had seemed trustworthy and had been part of Linda's daily work environment. The resolution of the identity theft case had led to changes in the way Linda's employer handled employee personal information, with new security procedures designed to prevent similar thefts in the future. Officer Wong had worked with the company's management to develop these procedures, helping them understand how identity theft occurred and what steps could be taken to protect employee data. Officer Wong turned onto Pine Street, passing the Williams family's house where the porch swing moved gently in the evening breeze, creating the soft creaking sound that had provided a backdrop to countless summer evenings when neighbors had gathered to share conversation and watch their children play in the tree-lined yards that gave the neighborhood its particular character. Williams' family had been affected by crime in a different way, becoming victims of a burglary that had violated their sense of home as a safe refuge from the world's uncertainties. The break-in had occurred during a family vacation, when Mr. and Mrs. Williams had been visiting their daughter in college and their house had stood empty for nearly a week. The burglars had been systematic and careful, taking items that would be difficult to trace while leaving behind property that might have been easily identified or that would have been difficult to transport. They had shown knowledge of the house's layout and the family's routine, suggesting that they had observed the property for some time before deciding to target it for theft. Mrs. Williams had discovered the burglary when the family had returned from their vacation, finding their back door standing open and several rooms showing obvious signs of having been searched by intruders. The violation had been immediately apparent, not just in the missing items, but in the subtle disarray that indicated strangers had been moving through their private spaces, touching their belongings and making decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. The items that had been stolen had included jewelry that had belonged to Mrs. Williams's grandmother, electronics that the family had saved to purchase, and family photographs that had no monetary value but that represented irreplaceable documentation of important moments in their lives together. The loss of these photographs had been particularly painful because they had contained images of family members who had died in events that could never be recreated. Officer Wong had worked with the Williams family to process not just the practical aspects of the burglary report, but also the emotional impact of having their home invaded by strangers. The family had struggled with feelings of vulnerability and violation that had affected their ability to feel safe and comfortable in their own house. Even after new locks had been installed and security measures had been improved, the investigation had eventually led to the arrest of 2 teenagers who had been responsible for several burglaries in the neighborhood. But the recovery of the stolen items had been only partial. Most of the electronics had been sold immediately after the theft, and the jewelry had been disposed of in ways that made recovery impossible. The family photographs had been discarded by the thieves who had not understood their value to the victims. Officer Wong continued her patrol along Oak Street, where the Henderson family had lived for more than 30 years, watching their children grow up and move away to start families of their own while maintaining the house as a gathering place where grandchildren could visit and experience the stability that had characterized their parents' childhoods in this neighborhood. Mr. Henderson had been the victim of a financial scam 2 years earlier, losing several $1,000s to criminals who had contacted him by phone claiming to represent a government agency that was investigating fraudulent charges on his Social Security account. The scammers had been sophisticated in their approach, using information about Mr. Henderson's personal history to make their story seem credible and creating a sense of urgency that had prevented him from thinking carefully about their requests. The scam had succeeded because the criminals had combined technical knowledge about government procedures with psychological manipulation that had exploited Mr. Henderson's desire to be a responsible citizen and his fear of becoming involved in legal problems through no fault of his own. They had convinced him that immediate action was necessary to protect his Social Security benefits and had guided him through the process of transferring money to accounts that they had controlled. The discovery that he had been victimized had been devastating for Mr. Henderson, who had prided himself on being careful with money and suspicious of schemes that seemed too good to be true. The realization that he had been manipulated, despite his caution, had shaken his confidence in his own judgment and had created embarrassment that had made it difficult for him to seek help in recovering his losses. Officer Wong had worked with Mr. Henderson and his family to report the scam and to take steps to prevent further victimization. But the practical prospects for recovering the stolen money had been limited because the criminals had operated from outside the United States and had used sophisticated methods for concealing their identities and locations. The case had become part of a broader investigation into international fraud schemes that targeted elderly Americans. But the complexity of these operations and the jurisdictional challenges they presented had made prosecution difficult and recovery of stolen funds nearly impossible for individual victims. Mrs. Henderson had been particularly affected by her husband's victimization, feeling guilty that she had not been present when the criminals had called and had not been able to help him recognize the scam before he had transferred the money. The incident had created tension in their marriage as they had struggled to understand how the fraud had succeeded and how they could protect themselves from similar schemes in the future. Officer Wong had connected the Henderson family with support services for victims of financial crimes, including counseling that had helped them understand that becoming a victim of sophisticated fraud was not a reflection of personal failure or inadequate intelligence, but rather evidence of how skilled criminals had become at manipulating people's natural instincts to trust authority figures and respond to apparent emergencies. The Henderson case had led to Officer Wong's involvement in community education programs designed to help elderly residents recognize and avoid financial scams. These programs had been conducted in partnership with local senior centers and community organizations, reaching hundreds of people with information about common fraud schemes and strategies for protecting themselves from criminal manipulation. The education programs had emphasized that financial fraud was a serious crime that affected people of all backgrounds and education levels, not just those who were naive or careless with their money. The programs had also provided practical advice about how to verify the identity of people who contacted them by phone or email, requesting personal information or money transfers. As Officer Wong completed her patrol and returned to her patrol car, she reflected on how each of these cases had affected not just the direct victims, but entire families and neighborhoods that had been forced to confront questions about safety, trust, and community responsibility. The crimes had created ripples that had extended far beyond their immediate targets, affecting relationships and assumptions that had provided the foundation for peaceful community life. But she had also seen how these same communities had responded to crime with resilience and mutual support, finding ways to help victims recover and to address the underlying conditions that had made criminal behavior possible. The process had been slow and sometimes frustrating, but it had ultimately strengthened the bonds that connected neighbors and had demonstrated the capacity of ordinary people to work together in addressing complex social problems. The neighborhoods she patrolled held thousands of such stories, each one representing a family that had been touched by crime and had found ways to heal and move forward. These stories were written not in police reports or court documents, but in the gradual restoration of trust, the patient work of rebuilding security, and the quiet conversations between neighbors who had learned to look out for one another in an uncertain world. The streetlights continued to cast their protective glow over the houses where these families slept, their dreams perhaps touched by memories of difficult times, but also by the knowledge that they lived in communities where people cared about one another's welfare and were willing to work together to maintain the safety and peace that made family life possible. Officer Wong's radio crackled softly with the routine communications that marked the progress of the night shift. But the neighborhoods around her remained peaceful, their residents resting securely in the knowledge that someone was watching over their streets and that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to strengthen the bonds of community that made their shared life together both possible and meaningful. Wall clock in the main duty room ticked with the steady persistence that had marked the passage of countless night shifts, its hands moving across a face that had been illuminated by the same soft fluorescent lights for more than 15 years. Detective Lieutenant Maria Santos sat at the central desk, surrounded by the quiet hum of radio communications and the gentle clicking of keyboards as officers processed the paperwork that transformed the day's incidents into permanent records that would join the thousands of files already archived in the basement below. The night shift had always possessed a different character from the day watch, operating at a pace that allowed for the kind of detailed attention to cases that the constant activity of daylight hours often made impossible. Between the routine patrols and occasional emergency calls, there were hours of relative quiet that could be devoted to the careful review of ongoing investigations, the follow-up work that often proved more important than the initial response to reported crimes. Detective Santos had chosen to work nights specifically for this opportunity to delve deeply into cases that required patience and sustained concentration. The files spread across her desk represented investigations that had been accumulating layers of complexity over weeks or months, each one requiring the kind of methodical analysis that could only be accomplished during the peaceful hours when interruptions were minimal and the mind could focus completely on the intricate patterns that connected evidence, witness statements, and the subtle indicators that often revealed the truth behind criminal activities. Tonight she was reviewing the Morrison fraud case, a complex investigation involving an elderly man who had been systematically defrauded by someone claiming to represent a home improvement company that specialized in services for senior citizens. The case had been developing for 3 months, as Detective Santos had worked to understand not just the specific crimes committed against Mr. Morrison, but also the broader pattern of fraudulent activities that seemed to be targeting elderly residents throughout the region. The file contained more than 200 pages of documentation, including bank records, telephone logs, witness statements, and correspondence that painted a detailed picture of how sophisticated criminals had identified vulnerable targets and developed elaborate schemes to separate them from their life savings. The complexity of the operation suggested professional criminals rather than the amateur opportunists who committed most of the financial crimes that came to police attention. Mr. Morrison had initially been contacted by phone by someone identifying himself as Tom Bradley from Bradley Home Services, a company that supposedly specialized in roof repairs, driveway sealing, and other maintenance services that elderly homeowners often needed, but were unable to perform themselves. The caller had explained that the company was offering special discounts to senior citizens in the area and had offered to provide a free inspection of Mr. Morrison's roof to identify any problems that might need immediate attention. The free inspection had revealed multiple problems that Mr. Bradley had claimed required immediate repair to prevent serious damage to Mr. Morrison's house. The repairs had been priced at several $1,000s, but Mr. Bradley had offered to arrange financing that would allow the work to be completed immediately with payments spread over several months at what had seemed like reasonable interest rates. Detective Santos had spent hours reviewing the documents that Mr. Morrison had signed, working with financial experts to understand how the fraudulent financing arrangement had been structured to extract far more money from Mr. Morrison than the actual value of any work that might have been performed on his house. The contracts had been deliberately complex and confusing, designed to obscure the true cost of the supposed improvements and the severe penalties that would be imposed if payments were missed. The investigation had revealed that Bradley Home Services existed only as a phone number and a post office box, with no actual business license, insurance, or legitimate credentials for performing the kind of work they had promised to provide. The individuals operating the scheme had used false names and identities, making them difficult to trace through conventional investigative methods. However, Detective Santos had been able to identify patterns in the way the fraud had been conducted that connected it to similar schemes operating in other parts of the state. Working with federal investigators who specialized in interstate fraud cases, she had begun to map a criminal network that had been victimizing elderly people across multiple jurisdictions using variations of the same basic approach. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Santos had discovered that the phone number used by Bradley Home Services had been connected to similar fraudulent companies that had operated under different names in other regions. By tracking the telecommunications records associated with these numbers, investigators had been able to identify a calling center where multiple fraudulent operations had been coordinated. The calling center had been located in a rented office space in another state, staffed by individuals who had used scripts and training materials to conduct the telephone contacts that initiated the fraudulent schemes. Detective Santos had worked with federal agents to coordinate surveillance of the operation, gathering evidence that could be used to prosecute all of the individuals involved in the criminal enterprise. The case had required months of patient investigation to develop sufficient evidence for prosecution, but the eventual arrests had dismantled an operation that had victimized more than 50 elderly people and had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. Through various fraudulent schemes, Mr. Morrison had eventually been able to recover most of his losses through restitution requirements that had been included in the criminal sentences. More importantly, the investigation had led to the development of educational programs designed to help elderly residents recognize and avoid similar fraudulent schemes. Detective Santos had worked with local senior centers to present information about common fraud tactics and to provide resources that elderly people could use to verify the legitimacy of companies that contacted them offering services or requesting personal information. Morrison case file exemplified the kind of complex investigation that could only be conducted effectively during the quiet hours of the night shift, when Detective Santos could spread documents across her desk and trace connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information without the constant interruptions that characterized the day watch. Across the duty room, Officer James Kim was working on a missing person report that had been filed earlier that evening by Mrs. Dorothy Chun, whose adult daughter had failed to return home from work and had not answered her phone for several hours. The case had initially seemed straightforward, but Officer Kim's patient review of the circumstances had revealed details that suggested the disappearance might be more complex than a simple failure to communicate. The missing person was Linda Chun, a 26-year-old nurse who worked at the regional medical sent her and lived with her parents while saving money to purchase her own home. Mrs. Chun had explained that Linda was extremely reliable about staying in touch with her family and had never previously failed to call if she was going to be late. Coming home from work, Officer Kim had contacted the medical center to verify that Linda had completed her shift as scheduled. Learning that she had left the hospital at her normal time and had mentioned to coworkers that she was planning to stop at the grocery store before going home. However, the grocery store where Linda usually shopped had no record of her having made any purchases that evening. The investigation had expanded to include a review of Linda's recent activities and relationships, seeking any information that might explain her uncharacteristic absence or suggest locations where she might have gone. Officer Kim had spoken with Linda's friends and coworkers, learning that she had been dealing with stress related to a relationship that had recently ended but had not expressed any intentions to leave town or take time away from her regular routine. Linda's car had been found in the parking lot of a shopping center, several miles from her usual route home, abandoned with no signs of struggle or forced entry, but also no indication of where Linda might have gone after leaving the vehicle. The location of the car had not corresponded to any of Linda's known destinations or interests. Adding to the mystery of her disappearance, Officer Kim had worked with detectives to review security camera footage from the shopping center, hoping to identify when Linda's car had been left in the parking lot and whether she had been accompanied by anyone who might provide clues about her current whereabouts. The footage had shown Linda arriving at the shopping center alone but had not captured her leaving the area. Investigation had revealed that Linda had been receiving unwanted attention from a former boyfriend who had been having difficulty accepting the end of their relationship. Robert Martinez had been calling Linda repeatedly and had shown up at her workplace despite her requests that he leave her alone. While he had not made any direct threats, his behavior had been causing Linda considerable anxiety and had led her to consider obtaining a restraining order. Officer Kim had immediately begun efforts to locate Robert Martinez, considering the possibility that Linda's disappearance might be connected to his persistent attempts to maintain contact with her against her wishes. The investigation had expanded to include checks of locations where Robert was known to spend time and interviews with his friends and family members who might have information about his recent activities. The case had been resolved when Linda had been found safe at a friend's house in a neighboring town, where she had gone to escape the stress of Robert's unwanted attention and to think about how to handle the situation. She had not informed her parents about her plans because she had not wanted them to worry about the problems she had been having with her former boyfriend. The resolution had included obtaining a restraining order against Robert Martinez and connecting Linda with resources for dealing with stalking behavior. Officer Kim had also worked with Linda and her family to develop safety strategies that would protect her while allowing her to maintain her independence and normal activities. The case had demonstrated the importance of the patient, thorough approach that characterized night shift investigations. Officer Kim's careful attention to details that might have seemed insignificant had led to the identification of the stalking behavior that had motivated Linda's decision to leave town without notice. His methodical investigation had ensured that Linda was found safely and that appropriate steps were taken to address the underlying problems that had created the dangerous situation. Detective Sarah Wong was working at a computer terminal, reviewing digital evidence related to a cybercrime case that involved the theft of personal information from a local business's customer database. The investigation had required her to develop new skills in computer forensics, working with federal experts to understand how criminals had gained unauthorized access to supposedly secure computer systems. The targeted business had been Patterson Electronics, a local retailer that had served the community for more than 20 years and had built a reputation for honest dealing and customer service. The company had recently begun accepting online orders through a website that stored customer credit card information and personal details for the convenience of repeat customers. The security breach had been discovered when several customers had reported unauthorized charges on credit cards they had used to make purchases from Patterson Electronics. The pattern of fraudulent activity had suggested that criminals had gained access to the store's customer database and had begun using the stolen information to make online purchases and cash advances. Detective Wong had worked with the company's computer technician to understand how the security breach might have occurred. Learning that the business's website had not been updated with the latest security measures and had been vulnerable to the kind of sophisticated attacks that professional cybercriminals routinely use to gain access to customer databases. The investigation had revealed that the attack had been conducted by a criminal organization that specialized in stealing customer information from small businesses that lacked the resources to maintain state-of-the-art cybersecurity measures. The criminals had used automated tools to identify vulnerable websites and had systematically attacked dozens of small businesses across multiple states. Detective Wong had coordinated with federal cybercrime investigators to track the stolen information and identify the individuals responsible for the security breach. The investigation had required months of technical analysis to trace the digital footprints left by the criminals and to gather evidence that could be used in prosecution. The case had concluded with the arrest of several individuals who had been operating the cybercrime organization, though the complex nature of online criminal activities had made it impossible to recover all of the stolen information or prevent all of the fraudulent activities that had resulted from the security breach. The investigation had also led to improvements in cybersecurity practices at Patterson Electronics and other small businesses in the community. Detective Wong had worked with local business organizations to provide education about cybersecurity threats and to connect small businesses with resources for protecting their customers' information. The cybercrime case had exemplified the changing nature of police work in an era when criminals increasingly use technology to commit crimes that cross traditional jurisdictional boundaries. Detective Wong had found that investigating these crimes required not just traditional detective skills but also technical knowledge and cooperation with federal agencies that had specialized expertise in cybercrime. The night shift provided the ideal environment for this kind of complex investigation, allowing Detective Wong to focus on the detailed technical analysis that cybercrime cases required, while also maintaining contact with federal investigators, who often worked during different hours due to the national scope of their investigations. As the night progressed, the duty room had settled into the quiet rhythm that characterized the late hours when most of the city slept peacefully and police work focused on the careful processing of information rather than the immediate response to emergencies. The radio communications had become sporadic, marking routine patrols and occasional minor incidents that were resolved quickly without requiring extensive investigation. Sergeant Michael Torres sat at the watch commander's desk, reviewing the reports that had been filed during the evening shift and planning the deployment of patrol units for the remaining hours of the night. His role required maintaining awareness of all ongoing investigations while also ensuring that the immediate needs of the community for police services were met efficiently and professionally. The reports spread across Sergeant Torres's desk represented the full spectrum of police work, from traffic accidents and minor disputes to complex criminal investigations that would require weeks or months of sustained effort to resolve. Each report documented not just the facts of specific incidents, but also the human stories that lay behind the official language of police documentation. A domestic dispute report described a family argument that had escalated beyond normal levels but had been resolved through patient mediation rather than arrests. The responding officers had worked with both spouses to understand the underlying tensions that had created the conflict and had connected them with counseling resources that could help them develop better communication strategies. A vandalism report documented damage to a local business that had been caused by teenagers who had been drinking in a nearby park. The investigation had focused not just on identifying the individuals responsible for the damage, but also on understanding why the park had become a gathering place for underage drinking and what steps could be taken to address the underlying problems. A theft report described the loss of tools from a construction site that had been targeted by thieves who had shown detailed knowledge of the site's security procedures and work schedules. The investigation had revealed that the theft had been an inside job committed by someone with authorized access to the site who had been struggling with personal financial problems. Each of these cases represented opportunities to address not just the immediate criminal behavior, but also the underlying conditions that had created the problems in the first place. The night shift provided the time and mental space necessary for this kind of comprehensive approach to police work, allowing officers to think beyond the immediate requirements of law enforcement to consider the broader social context in which crimes occurred. The clock on the duty room wall continued its steady progression toward dawn, marking time that moved at the pace of careful thought rather than urgent action. The files and reports spread across the desks documented the patient work of maintaining order and safety in a community that depended on the quiet professionalism of officers who understood that their most important tool was not their authority but their ability to understand people and help them find constructive solutions to the problems that brought chaos into their lives. Outside, the city slept under the protection of officers who moved through empty streets with the watchful attention that came from years of experience in recognizing the subtle signs that indicated when intervention might be necessary. The radio traffic that connected these patrol units to the duty room had become a quiet murmur that provided a reassuring background to the concentrated work of analysis and investigation that filled the peaceful hours of the night shift. As the night advanced toward its conclusion, the duty room would gradually prepare for the transition to day watch, organizing the files and reports that would be passed to the incoming shift, along with briefings about ongoing investigations and developing situations that would require continued attention. But for now, the night shift continued its patient work, maintaining the careful vigilance that allowed the community to rest securely in the knowledge that someone was always watching, always ready to respond to whatever challenges the darkness might bring. The evidence room existed in a state of perpetual twilight, illuminated by soft overhead lights that cast no shadows but created a gentle, even glow across the rows of metal shelving that stretched from floor to ceiling along every wall. Evidence technician Robert Chun moved through these aisles with the quiet reverence of someone who understood that he was the keeper of thousands of stories, each one represented by carefully labeled boxes, sealed envelopes, and plastic containers that held the physical remnants of human dramas that had played out across decades of police investigations. The air in the evidence room carried the particular scent of old paper, preserved fabrics, and the faint chemical odor of photographic processing solutions that had long since dried, but had left their mark on the atmosphere of this underground sanctuary. Every item here had once been crucial evidence in someone's search for justice, truth, or closure. But time had transformed these urgent artifacts into historical documents that spoke of cases resolved and lives moved forward beyond the crises that had once defined them. Robert paused before Section M, where cases from the 1980s were stored in chronological order, each box labeled with case numbers that corresponded to detailed logs that tracked every piece of evidence from the moment of its collection through its eventual disposition. He pulled down box M847, which contained evidence from a missing person case that had been resolved 15 years after the initial investigation. A testament to the patience and persistence that characterized the best police work, the box contained more than 300 photographs, each one documenting a different aspect of the search for 16-year-old Jennifer Walsh, who had disappeared from her high school campus on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1985. The photographs had been taken by multiple officers over the course of several years, creating a visual record of an investigation that had mobilized the entire police department and had engaged hundreds of volunteers from throughout the community. First photograph showed Jennifer's abandoned bicycle, found 3 days after her disappearance in a wooded area behind the school that students sometimes used as a shortcut to nearby neighborhoods. The bicycle had been photographed from every angle, its position carefully documented to preserve any clues that might indicate what had happened to Jennifer after she had left the school grounds. Asterisk. Detective Sarah Park had been assigned as the lead investigator on the Jennifer Walsh case, working with a team of officers and volunteers who had conducted the most comprehensive search effort in the department's history. The photographs documented not just the physical evidence that had been collected, but also the human dimension of the investigation, capturing images of search teams combing through wooded areas, volunteers posting missing person flyers throughout the city, and family members maintaining their vigil of hope despite the passage of weeks and months without any significant developments. One photograph showed Jennifer's bedroom, preserved exactly as she had left it on the morning of her disappearance, with school books stacked on her desk and clothes laid out for the next day that she would never see. Her parents had maintained the room as a shrine to their missing daughter, refusing to disturb anything that might provide clues about her state of mind or her plans on the day she had vanished. The walls of Jennifer's bedroom had been covered with photographs of friends, family members, and school activities that painted a picture of a normal teenager with the typical interests and relationships that characterized most 16-year-old girls. Detective Park had spent hours studying these photographs, looking for any indication of problems or concerns that Jennifer might not have shared with her parents, but that might be revealed through her choice of images to preserve and display. Robert found a series of photographs that documented the extensive ground search that had been conducted in the weeks following Jennifer's disappearance. Teams of volunteers had systematically searched every wooded area, abandoned building, and vacant lot within a 20-mile radius of the school, using techniques borrowed from search and rescue operations to ensure that no potential location was overlooked. The search photographs captured the dedication and determination of community members who had devoted their weekends and evenings to looking for Jennifer, their faces reflecting the shared hope that she would be found alive, and the growing fear that time was working against the possibility of a positive outcome. Some of the photographs showed searchers working in harsh weather conditions, refusing to suspend their efforts despite rain and cold that made the work difficult and unpleasant. The case had taken an unexpected turn 6 months after Jennifer's disappearance, when she had called her parents from a town more than 300 miles away, explaining that she had left home voluntarily because she had been unable to cope with pressures at school and at home that had made her feel trapped and hopeless. The phone call had ended the search effort but had begun a new phase of the investigation focused on understanding why Jennifer had felt unable to ask for help before reaching the point of desperation that had motivated her decision to disappear. Detective Park had traveled to bring Jennifer home, conducting careful interviews with her during the return trip to understand the circumstances that had led to her disappearance and to assess what support services might be needed to prevent similar crises in the future. The conversations had revealed complex emotional and social pressures that Jennifer had been experiencing but had been unable to articulate to the adults in her life who might have been able to help her find solutions. The photographs from Jennifer's return showed a family reunion marked by both joy and the recognition that the experience had changed everyone involved in ways that would require time and professional support to fully understand and address. Jennifer's parents had arranged for family counseling to help them develop better communication strategies and to ensure that similar misunderstandings would not create future crises. The resolution of the Jennifer Walsh case had led to changes in the way the school district approached student counseling and mental health support, recognizing that some students needed more intensive intervention than traditional guidance counseling could provide. Detective Park had worked with school officials to develop procedures for identifying students who might be at risk for running away and connecting them with appropriate resources before they reached crisis levels. Robert returned the Jennifer Walsh photographs to their box and selected another container, this one containing evidence from an art theft case that had been solved through the kind of patient detective work that could only be conducted over months of sustained investigation. The case had involved the theft of several valuable paintings from the city's art museum, a crime that had shocked the cultural community and had required specialized investigative techniques to solve. The photographs documented the crime scene at the museum, showing the empty frames where the stolen paintings had hung and the sophisticated security systems that the thieves had somehow managed to defeat without triggering alarms or leaving obvious traces of their presence. The theft had been discovered by museum staff when they had arrived for work on a Monday morning, finding gaps in the permanent collection that represented decades of careful acquisition and curation. Detective Michael Torres had been assigned to investigate the art theft, working with federal agents who specialized in crimes against cultural institutions and with international law enforcement agencies that tracked stolen artwork through global markets. The investigation had required him to develop expertise in art history, museum security procedures, and the complex international networks through which stolen cultural artifacts were bought and sold. The case photographs included detailed images of each stolen painting, documenting not just their artistic and monetary value, but also their significance to the community that had supported the museum's efforts to build a collection that reflected the region's cultural heritage. The stolen works had included pieces by local artists whose work had gained national recognition, as well as historical artifacts that connected the community to its past. The breakthrough in the art theft case had come through international cooperation, when similar paintings had been offered for sale at auction houses in other countries by sellers whose credentials had raised suspicions among art dealers who were familiar with the legitimate provenance of significant artworks. Detective Torres had worked with federal investigators to track these sales attempts back to their source, eventually identifying a sophisticated criminal organization that specialized in stealing and reselling cultural artifacts. Recovery of the stolen paintings had required complex negotiations with foreign law enforcement agencies and had taken more than 2 years to complete. But eventually, all of the stolen artworks had been returned to the museum, where they had resumed their places in the permanent collection. The case had led to improved security measures at cultural institutions throughout the region and had demonstrated the importance of international cooperation in addressing crimes that crossed national boundaries. Robert found photographs documenting the return of the stolen paintings to the museum, showing community members gathering to celebrate the recovery of artworks that had become symbols of cultural identity and shared heritage. The celebration had marked not just the successful conclusion of a criminal investigation, but also the community's commitment to preserving and protecting the cultural resources that enriched Everyone's lives. The next box contained evidence from a domestic violence case that had been remarkable, not for the severity of the crimes involved, but for the comprehensive approach that had been taken to address the underlying problems that had created the violent situation. The photographs documented both the immediate aftermath of the domestic violence and the long-term process of healing and rehabilitation that had followed. The initial photographs showed the scene of a domestic dispute that had escalated to physical violence, with images of damaged furniture and personal belongings that reflected the chaos and fear that had characterized the household during the period when abuse had been occurring. The pictures captured not just the physical evidence of violence, but also the emotional atmosphere of a home where safety and security had been replaced by unpredictability and fear. Officer Lisa Park had responded to the domestic violence call, working with the victim to develop a safety plan that would protect her and her children while also addressing the complex factors that had made it difficult for her to leave the abusive relationship. The case had required ongoing intervention over several months as the victim had worked with counselors and social service providers to build the skills and resources necessary for independent living. The photographs documented the victim's gradual progress from the immediate crisis of the domestic violence to the establishment of a new life that provided safety and stability for her and her children. Images showed her new apartment, her children's adjustment to new schools and neighborhoods, and her participation in support groups that connected her with other survivors of domestic violence. The case had also included intervention with the perpetrator of the domestic violence, who had been required to participate in batterer intervention programs designed to address the attitudes and behaviors that had led to his abusive actions. The photographs showed his participation in counseling sessions and community service, activities that were intended to help him understand the impact of his behavior and develop more constructive approaches to managing stress and conflict. Officer Park had maintained contact with both the victim and the perpetrator for more than a year after the initial incident, monitoring the effectiveness of the interventions and providing ongoing support as both individuals had worked to rebuild their lives in ways that eliminated the possibility of future violence. The comprehensive approach had required coordination between multiple agencies and service providers, but had ultimately achieved lasting positive results. The domestic violence case photographs exemplified the kind of thorough documentation that allowed future investigators and service providers to understand not just what had happened, but also what interventions had been effective in preventing future problems. The images served as both historical record and instructional guide for addressing similar situations with the same comprehensive approach that had proved successful. Robert moved to Section N, where more recent cases were stored, pulling down a box that contained evidence from a cybercrime investigation that had required entirely new approaches to collecting and preserving digital evidence. The case had involved identity theft conducted through sophisticated online schemes that had victimized dozens of people throughout the region. The photographs in this box documented computer equipment that had been seized from the suspect's residence, showing the technical setup that had been used to conduct the identity theft scheme. Unlike traditional evidence photographs that captured physical objects, these images documented digital workspaces and electronic equipment that had been used to commit crimes that existed primarily in cyberspace. Detective Jennifer Wong had specialized in cybercrime investigations, developing expertise in computer forensics and digital evidence recovery that had allowed the police department to address criminal activities that had previously been beyond their technical capabilities. The identity theft case had required her to work with federal cybercrime specialists and private sector computer security experts to understand how the scheme had operated and gather evidence that could be used in prosecution. The case photographs included images of the suspects' computers, showing the sophisticated software they had used to steal personal information and create false identities for conducting fraudulent financial transactions. The investigation had revealed that the operation had been much larger than initially apparent, involving multiple individuals working together to victimize hundreds of people across several states. The resolution of the cybercrime case had required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and had resulted in convictions that had shut down a criminal organization that had been stealing millions of dollars through identity theft. The case had also led to improved cybersecurity awareness in the community and had demonstrated the growing importance of technical expertise in modern police work. Detective Wong had worked with local businesses and community organizations to provide education about cybersecurity threats and identity theft prevention. Using the case as an example of how sophisticated criminals had become in their use of technology to commit crimes, the educational programs had helped community members understand how to protect themselves from similar schemes and what steps to take if they became victims of identity theft. The final box Robert examined contained evidence from a cold case that had been solved after more than 20 years, demonstrating the value of preserving evidence and maintaining hope that even the most challenging cases could eventually be resolved. The case had involved the murder of a local business owner whose death had remained unsolved despite extensive investigation when it had first occurred. The photographs from the original investigation showed the crime scene and the evidence that had been collected, documenting the methodical approach that had been taken despite the lack of immediate leads or suspects. Detective Robert Kim had recently reopened the case, using new forensic techniques and technologies that had not been available when the crime had first been committed. The breakthrough had come through DNA evidence that had been preserved from the original crime scene but had not been testable with the technology available in the 1980s. Advanced forensic analysis had eventually identified the perpetrator, leading to an arrest that had finally provided closure for the victim's family after decades of uncertainty and grief. The cold case photographs documented both the original investigation and the recent developments that had led to its solution, showing how patience and technological advances had eventually overcome the challenges that had initially prevented the case from being solved. The resolution had provided validation for the decision to preserve all evidence from serious crimes, even when immediate solutions seemed impossible. As Robert completed his review of the evidence boxes, he reflected on the thousands of stories represented in the carefully organized containers that filled the evidence room. Each box held not just physical artifacts but also the memories and emotions of everyone who had been affected by the crimes they documented. The photographs, documents, and objects preserved here served as testimony to the human capacity for both creating harm and working to heal the damage that crime inflicted on individuals and communities. The evidence room stood as a monument to the patient work of police officers, forensic specialists, and all of the other professionals who had devoted their careers to seeking justice and truth through careful investigation and analysis. The items stored here would continue to serve their purpose as long as they might be needed, preserving the possibility that even cold cases might eventually be solved, and that families might finally find the closure they had sought for years or decades. Walking back through the aisles of evidence containers, Robert felt the weight of all the stories contained in this underground repository of human experience. Each box represented moments when ordinary people had faced extraordinary circumstances and had relied on police officers and other professionals who understood that their work was not simply about processing cases but about helping communities heal from the wounds that crime created in the fabric of civilized life. The evidence room would continue to preserve these stories for as long as they might be needed, maintaining the careful documentation that ensured that justice could be served, regardless of how much time had passed since crimes were committed. In this quiet, organized space, the past remained accessible to the future, holding its secrets with patient dignity until the moment when they might finally reveal the truth that families and communities needed to find peace. The morning mist rose from the river that wound through the heart of the city, creating soft gray curtains that transformed familiar landmarks into something mysterious and ethereal. Police Captain Elizabeth Martinez walked slowly across the old stone bridge that connected the downtown district to the residential neighborhoods on the east side, her footsteps echoing against the ancient masonry that had witnessed more than a century of human dramas, including several that had become part of the city's collective memory of how communities could respond to crime with both justice and compassion. The bridge itself had been the site of a remarkable case from the winter of 1989, when Officer David Park had prevented a suicide attempt by a young man whose involvement in a robbery had spiraled into despair and self-destructive behavior that had brought him to the edge of this span on a snowy February evening. The incident had become legendary within the police department, not because of its drama, but because of the patient, human approach that Officer Park had taken to a situation that could have ended tragically. 22-year-old Michael Rodriguez had climbed over the bridge's protective railing during the early hours of a Tuesday morning, intending to end his life rather than face prosecution for his participation in a convenience store robbery that had gone wrong and had left the elderly store owner hospitalized with injuries that had initially seemed life-threatening. Michael had been consumed by guilt and shame that had overwhelmed his ability to see any possibility for redemption or positive change in his future. Officer Park had been finishing his patrol shift when he had spotted Michael on the bridge, recognizing immediately that the young man was in crisis and needed help rather than law enforcement action. Instead of approaching with authority and urgency, Officer Park had simply sat down on the bridge near Michael and had begun a conversation that had lasted more than 3 hours, gradually drawing out the complex circumstances that had led to both the robbery and the suicide attempt. The conversation had revealed that Michael's involvement in the robbery had been motivated not by criminal intent, but by desperation created by his mother's medical bills and his family's financial crisis. He had been working 2 jobs while attending community college, trying to support his family while pursuing the education that he had hoped would eventually provide better opportunities for everyone he loved. When his mother had needed emergency surgery that insurance had not covered, Michael had fallen behind on rent and other basic expenses despite his best efforts to manage the family's finances. The robbery had been an impulsive decision made in a moment of panic, an attempt to solve immediate problems that had instead created much more serious long-term consequences. Officer Park had listened to Michael's story with the kind of patience and empathy that good police work sometimes required, recognizing that the young man was fundamentally decent but had made a terrible mistake under pressure that had clouded his judgment. The officer had worked gradually to help Michael understand that suicide would not solve his problems, but would instead create additional pain for his family and would eliminate any possibility for making amends for the harm he had caused. The resolution of the bridge incident had required not just preventing Michael's suicide, but also addressing the underlying problems that had created his desperation. Officer Park had worked with social services to arrange emergency financial assistance for Michael's family, had connected them with resources for managing medical debt, and had helped Michael find legal representation that could present his case in a way that acknowledged his remorse and his legitimate motivations. The convenience store owner, Mr. Kim, had recovered from his injuries and had actually requested the opportunity to meet with Michael as part of a restorative justice process that had allowed both men to understand each other's perspectives and work together toward healing. Mr. Kim had been moved by learning about the circumstances that had motivated the robbery and had become an advocate for Michael during the legal proceedings. Michael had eventually been sentenced to community service and probation rather than prison time, allowing him to continue working and supporting his family while making amends for his crime. He had completed his community service at the hospital where his mother had received treatment, working with elderly patients and learning about the healthcare system from the perspective of someone dedicated to helping, rather than exploiting vulnerable people. Captain Martinez paused at the center of the bridge, looking down at the water that reflected the morning sky and remembering how Officer Park's patient approach to the Michael Rodriguez case had influenced the entire department's understanding of how police work could address not just criminal behavior, but also the human circumstances that often motivated desperate actions. The bridge had become a symbol of the possibility for redemption and the importance of seeing beyond immediate actions to understand the complex factors that shaped human behavior. She continued her walk through the downtown district, passing the site where Patterson's Electronics had once operated before the owner's retirement had closed a business that had served the community for more than 30 years. The building now housed a coffee shop, but Captain Martinez remembered the case that had made the electronics store a landmark in the department's history of community-oriented policing. Store had been targeted by a series of burglaries during the summer of 1992, crimes that had threatened to destroy a business that had become an important gathering place for people interested in technology and electronics. Rather than simply investigating the burglaries as separate incidents, Detective Jennifer Wong had approached the case as an opportunity to strengthen the relationship between the business and the surrounding neighborhood. The investigation had revealed that the burglaries had been committed by a group of teenagers who had been fascinated by electronics, but had lacked legitimate opportunities to explore their interests or develop their technical skills. Detective Wong had worked with Mr. Patterson to develop a mentorship program that provided the teenagers with legal access to the kinds of equipment and knowledge they had been seeking through their criminal activities. The program had transformed potential criminals into enthusiastic students, with several of the young people eventually pursuing careers in technology and electronics. Mr. Patterson had found the experience so rewarding that he had continued the mentorship program for many years, creating opportunities for dozens of young people to develop technical skills, while also learning about business ethics and community responsibility. The success of the Patterson Electronics Mentorship Program had inspired similar initiatives throughout the city, with businesses and police working together to create positive alternatives for young people who might otherwise have been drawn into criminal activities. Detective Wong had been recognized nationally for her innovative approach to crime prevention, but she had always emphasized that the real credit belonged to Mr. Patterson and the community members who had been willing to see potential rather than just problems in young people who had made mistakes. Captain Martinez turned onto Elm Street, walking past the house where the Chun family had lived during the period when their daughter Linda had been stalked by a former boyfriend whose inability to accept the end of their relationship had escalated into criminal behavior that had threatened not just Linda but her entire family. The house looked exactly as it had during that difficult period, but Captain Martinez knew that the family's experience had led to important changes in how law enforcement addressed stalking cases. The stalking case had been handled by Officer Michael Torres, who had recognized that Linda Chun's situation required more than simply taking reports and filing restraining orders. The persistent nature of stalking behavior meant that victims often needed ongoing support and protection that went beyond what traditional police responses could provide. Officer Torres had worked with Linda and her family to develop a comprehensive safety plan that included not just legal protections, but also practical strategies for managing daily activities in ways that minimize the opportunities for the stalker to make contact or gather information about Linda's routine. The approach had required coordination between police, the court system, and community organizations that provided support services for stalking victims. The case had also included a focus on addressing the stalker's behavior through counseling and supervision that was designed to help him understand the impact of his actions and develop healthier approaches to relationships and rejection. Officer Torres had worked with mental health professionals to ensure that the intervention addressed both the immediate safety concerns and the underlying psychological factors that had motivated the stalking behavior. The comprehensive approach to the Chun stalking case had become a model for how police departments could address the complex challenges that stalking cases presented. Officer Torres had presented the case at conferences throughout the region, sharing the strategies that had proved effective and helping other departments develop similar approaches to protecting stalking victims while also addressing the behavior of perpetrators. Linda Chun had eventually been able to resume her normal activities without fear, and her stalker had successfully completed counseling and had not engaged in any further criminal behavior. The case had demonstrated that patient, comprehensive intervention could achieve lasting positive results, even in situations that had initially seemed intractable. Captain Martinez walked through the business district, passing the building that had once housed the law offices where a complex embezzlement case had been discovered and investigated during the mid-1990s. Case had been remarkable not for the amount of money involved, but for the way it had been handled with attention to both justice and the human factors that had contributed to the criminal behavior. The embezzlement had been committed by Sarah Williams, a trusted office manager who had been stealing money from client accounts over a period of several years. The discovery of the theft had shocked everyone who knew Sarah, as she had been regarded as completely honest and reliable by her employers and colleagues. Detective Robert Kim had investigated the embezzlement case with careful attention to understanding not just how the theft had been conducted, but also why someone with Sarah's reputation for integrity had become involved in criminal behavior. The investigation had revealed that Sarah had been struggling with mounting medical bills for her disabled son's care, expenses that had overwhelmed her family's finances despite their careful budgeting and her husband's stable employment. The embezzlement had begun as small, temporary borrowing that Sarah had intended to repay quickly. But the continuing medical expenses had made repayment impossible and had led to increasingly desperate attempts to cover the missing money through additional theft. Sarah had been trapped in a cycle of criminal behavior that had grown beyond her ability to control or resolve independently. Detective Kim had worked with prosecutors to develop a resolution that held Sarah accountable for her actions while also recognizing the legitimate needs that had motivated her desperate behavior. Sarah had been required to make full restitution and had received a suspended sentence that included community service and financial counseling designed to help her family develop sustainable approaches to managing their ongoing medical expenses. The law firm had recovered all of the stolen money and had actually hired Sarah to work part-time, helping them improve their financial controls and procedures. Recognizing that her experience had given her unique insights into how embezzlement could occur and how it could be prevented, Sarah's work had helped the firm develop security measures that had been adopted by other businesses throughout the community. The last filing cabinet, in the deepest section of the archives, stood slightly apart from the others, its metal surface worn smooth by decades of careful handling. Chief Archivist Dorothy Chun approached it with the reverence that came from knowing she was about to open the repository, where the department's most significant cases had found their final rest. This cabinet contained not just closed files but completed stories. Investigations that had taught the entire community something important about justice, compassion, and the complex nature of human behavior. The silence here was different from the quiet that characterized other sections of the archives. It was not the silence of waiting or suspension, but the deep peace that came with resolution and understanding. Each file in this cabinet represented a journey that had begun with crisis and uncertainty, but had ended with the kind of closure that allowed everyone involved to move forward with wisdom gained and healing. Achieved. Dorothy pulled open the top drawer, revealing files that had been selected for their significance not because of their dramatic nature, but because of the profound lessons they had taught about the possibilities for positive change and redemption that existed, even in the most challenging circumstances. These were the cases that new officers studied to understand what police work could accomplish when it was conducted with patience, wisdom, and genuine commitment to serving the community's deepest needs. The first file she withdrew contained the complete record of the Morrison family case, an investigation that had spanned more than 2 years and had ultimately transformed not just the lives of the people directly involved, but the entire department's approach to addressing domestic violence and family crisis. The file was thick with reports, correspondence, and documentation that traced the family's journey from crisis to healing with the kind of thorough attention that had made lasting, positive change possible. The Morrison case had begun with a routine domestic violence call, but Officer Jennifer Wong had recognized that the situation required more than the standard law enforcement response. The family had been trapped in cycles of conflict and violence that had their roots in unemployment, substance abuse, and untreated mental health, issues that had created a volatile situation affecting not just the parents but also 3 young children who had been living in an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, rather than simply arresting the perpetrator and connecting the victim with emergency services. Officer Wong had worked with a team of social workers, counselors, and community organizations to develop a comprehensive intervention that addressed all of the underlying factors that had contributed to the family's crisis. The approach had required months of sustained effort and coordination between multiple agencies, but it had ultimately achieved results that traditional responses had not been able to accomplish. The father, David Morrison, had completed treatment for alcohol addiction and had participated in anger management counseling that had helped him develop constructive approaches to managing stress and conflict. He had also received assistance with job training and placement that had addressed the economic pressures that had contributed to his drinking and violent behavior. The mother, Patricia Morrison, had received support services that had helped her develop independence and confidence while also learning parenting strategies that created a more stable and nurturing environment for the children. She had participated in support groups with other survivors of domestic violence, finding strength and encouragement through shared experiences and mutual assistance. The children had received counseling and educational support that had helped them process their traumatic experiences while also providing them with the stability and security they needed to develop normally. The oldest child, 8-year-old Michael, had been particularly affected by the family violence but had shown remarkable resilience when provided with appropriate support and intervention. The Morrison case file included follow-up reports documenting the family's progress over several years, showing how the comprehensive intervention had achieved lasting positive results. The family had remained together, with David maintaining his sobriety and employment, while Patricia had pursued educational opportunities that had increased her independence and self-confidence. The children had thrived in the stable environment that their parents had learned to create and maintain. More importantly, the Morrison case had influenced the development of new protocols for responding to domestic violence throughout the region. Officer Wong had presented the case at conferences and training sessions, sharing the strategies that had proved effective and helping other departments develop similar comprehensive approaches to family crisis intervention. Dorothy found a letter in the file from Patricia Morrison, written 5 years after the initial crisis, thanking Officer Wong and all of the other professionals who had helped her family heal and grow stronger. The letter described how the intervention had not only ended the violence but had actually brought the family closer together and had given them tools for managing future challenges. Constructively, the letter also mentioned that David Morrison had become a volunteer counselor with a program that helped other men address addiction and anger issues, using his own experience to guide others who were struggling with similar problems. Patricia had completed her college degree and had begun working as a victim advocate, helping other women navigate the complex process of leaving abusive relationships and building new lives for themselves and their children. Dorothy carefully returned the Morrison file to its place and selected another folder, this one containing the complete record of the Jefferson High School case, an investigation that had addressed a complex situation involving drug dealing, gang activity, and the social pressures that made young people vulnerable to involvement in criminal behavior. The case had begun when several students had been arrested for selling drugs on campus. But Detective Michael Torres had recognized that the problem required more than individual prosecutions to achieve lasting solutions. The investigation had revealed that the drug dealing was part of a larger pattern of criminal activity that had been affecting students throughout the district, creating an atmosphere of fear and violence that had disrupted the educational mission of the schools. Rather than simply processing the arrested students through the juvenile justice system, Detective Torres had worked with school administrators, parents, and community organizations to develop a comprehensive response that addressed both the immediate criminal activity and the underlying conditions that had made students vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations. Intervention had included not just law enforcement action against the adult criminals who had been exploiting students, but also educational and support programs that provided young people with positive alternatives to criminal involvement. Detective Torres had coordinated with community organizations to create after-school programs, mentorship opportunities, and job training initiatives that gave students constructive ways to earn money and gain recognition. The school district had also implemented new counseling and intervention programs designed to identify students who might be at risk for involvement in criminal activity and connect them with appropriate support services before they reached crisis levels. The programs had emphasized early intervention and prevention rather than simply responding to problems after they had already developed. The Jefferson High School case had required more than 3 years to fully resolve, but the comprehensive approach had achieved remarkable results. Drug dealing and gang activity on campus had been eliminated. Academic performance throughout the district had improved, and many of the students who had initially been involved in criminal activities had gone on to complete their education and pursue positive life paths. Case file included graduation photographs and letters from students who had been redirected from criminal involvement to educational achievement through the intervention programs that had been developed in response to the crisis. Several former students had written to thank Detective Torres for seeing potential rather than just problems and for working to address the underlying issues that had made them vulnerable to criminal recruitment. One letter was from Maria Santos, who had been one of the students arrested for drug dealing, but had gone on to complete college and begin a career in social work. She had written to explain how the intervention had changed not just her immediate circumstances but her entire understanding of her own potential, and the cave understanding of her own potential, possibilities that existed for building a positive future. Another letter was from Michael Rodriguez, who had been heavily involved in gang activity but had used the mentorship program to develop interests in technology and computer programming that had led to successful employment and a stable family life. He had written to describe how the comprehensive approach had provided him with the support and opportunities he had needed to make positive changes in his life. The Jefferson High School case had influenced educational and law enforcement policies throughout the state, with many districts adopting similar comprehensive approaches to addressing juvenile crime and gang activity. Detective Torres had been recognized nationally for his innovative work, but he had always emphasized that the success had been achieved through community collaboration rather than individual effort. Dorothy selected a final file from the cabinet, this one containing the complete record of the Riverside District Community Policing Initiative, a program that had transformed an entire neighborhood from one of the city's most troubled areas into a model of community cooperation and mutual support. The Riverside District had been characterized by high crime rates, deteriorating housing, and social problems that had created a cycle of poverty and violence that had affected multiple generations of residents. Traditional law enforcement approaches had been unsuccessful in addressing the complex interrelated problems that had made the neighborhood a center of criminal activity. Officer Patricia Wong had been assigned to develop a new approach to policing the Riverside District, working with residents, business owners, and community organizations to create partnerships that address not just criminal behavior, but also the underlying social and economic conditions that had made crime attractive to many neighborhood residents. The Community Policing Initiative had included regular neighborhood meetings where residents could discuss their concerns and work with police to develop strategies for addressing problems before they escalated into criminal activity. Officer Wong had spent hundreds of hours walking through the neighborhood, getting to know residents personally and understanding the challenges they faced in their daily lives. The program had also included economic development initiatives designed to create legitimate employment opportunities for neighborhood residents, educational programs that helped people develop job skills and financial literacy, and social services that addressed problems like substance abuse and mental health issues that had contributed to the cycle of poverty and crime. The transformation of the Riverside District had taken more than 5 years to achieve, but the results had been remarkable. Crime rates had decreased dramatically, property values had increased, and the neighborhood had developed the kind of social cohesion that made residents feel safe and proud of their community. The case file included photographs documenting the neighborhood's transformation, showing the renovation of deteriorating buildings, the creation of community gardens and recreational facilities, and the establishment of small businesses that had brought economic vitality to the area. The images captured not just physical improvements, but also the change in atmosphere that had made the Riverside District an attractive place to live and raise families. More importantly, the file contained documentation of how the Community Policing Initiative had changed the relationship between police and residents throughout the city. The success in the Riverside District had demonstrated that law enforcement could be a positive force for community development, rather than simply a response to problems after they had already occurred. Officer Wong had received numerous awards for her work in the Riverside District, but the most meaningful recognition had come from neighborhood residents who had invited her to family celebrations and community events as someone who had become an integral part of their lives rather than an outside authority figure. As Dorothy closed the final file and returned it to its place in the cabinet, She reflected on the thousands of stories contained in the archives and the wisdom they represented about the possibilities for positive change that existed even in the most challenging circumstances. Each case had taught important lessons about the nature of criminal behavior and the approaches that could be most effective in addressing both immediate problems and their underlying causes. The archives held the institutional memory of a police department that had learned to see its mission not simply as enforcing laws, but as protecting and strengthening the communities it served. The files documented the patient work of officers who had understood that lasting solutions required addressing the human factors that contributed to criminal behavior rather than simply punishing people after crimes had been committed. The stories preserved in these filing cabinets would continue to serve as guides for future officers who would face similar challenges and would need the wisdom gained from previous experience to develop effective responses to new problems. The archive represented a form of collective knowledge that could help communities continue to evolve and improve their approaches to maintaining safety and security while also promoting justice and human dignity. Dorothy switched off the lights in the archive section and walked slowly back through the corridors lined with filing cabinets, each one holding thousands of stories about human behavior at its most complex and challenging. But she carried with her the knowledge that even the most difficult cases could lead to positive outcomes when they were approached with patience, wisdom, and genuine commitment to serving the community's deepest needs. The building around her settled into its nighttime quiet, but the stories contained in the archives continued to serve their purpose, preserving the lessons learned from decades of police work that had been conducted with professionalism, compassion, and understanding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to apply the wisdom contained in these files to the ongoing work of maintaining communities where all people could live with safety and dignity. As Dorothy left the building and walked out into the peaceful night, she felt the satisfaction that came from knowing that her work helped preserve the institutional memory that would guide future generations of police officers in their efforts to serve and protect their communities. The archives would continue to hold their stories with quiet dignity, waiting for the moment when their wisdom might be needed to help solve new problems or provide guidance for addressing challenges that had not yet been encountered. The city around her slept peacefully, protected by officers who carried forward the lessons contained in the archived cases, their work guided by the accumulated wisdom of all those who had served before them and had learned that effective police work required not just professional skills but also human understanding and community commitment. The stories in the archives had found their rest, but their influence would continue to shape the ongoing effort to create communities where justice and compassion work together to promote the safety and well-being of all people.